And I guess it just begs the question, the committees of jurisdiction, certainly your committee has been involved in this. A lot of time in your committee has been taken up with this process. No question, the Intelligence Committee has been doing this work. I don't know if they had other work they should have been doing this fall, but they've been doing this work exclusively. And although I'm a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, and certainly we have our jurisdictional tussles with the Committee on Ways and Means, it bothers me that the Committee on Ways and Means has had to give up their hearing room for all of these weeks so that Intelligence and then Judiciary could hold the hearings on the articles of impeachment in the Ways and Means hearing room. Does this bother anyone else that all of Congress's attention has been diverted to this at the exclusion of every other process?
It bothers me. Believe me, I'll let the Ways and Means folks, no offense to them, I'll let them keep their room. I prefer Judiciary and others. Look, I'm not going to, be one. I think we've had a large number, especially Judiciary Committee this year. We have passed other bills, and I will disagree with those. And there's some we've actually made bipartisanly, but it's not been. It's been a start and stop process. I remember when impeachment was taken away from us, and is the way we described it. And in September, we went like almost a two and a half week period. We didn't know what to do. I mean, because we literally had been doing so much of investigations and Mueller and everything that there was nothing in the hopper, so to speak, for us to move forward on. And the chairman did a good job, I think, trying to recover from that. And, I disagree with some of the bills that we passed, but at least we had some other hearings. I think over time, without elaborating on this a great deal, I think the biggest issue that we have here is at the end of the day, I think there's a large decision being made. And that decision is being made on, we need to do this, now. And I disagree vehemently with the majority on this minute. We need to do this now. But I do, after taking a step back, look at because we've had to live with it in Judiciary in particular this year, the institutional discussion and damage, as I would call it, to our rules and our processes and our things. Those are the things that concern me, the most, whether I'm here or not, because the good thing, the logical thing is all of us here will not be here in, a number of years, whatever that years may be, but there will be others. And, the Intelligence Committee is a committee you used to never hear of. It was a committee that did its job in silence, in the dark, in the basement. When I first got here, Mike Rogers and Mr. Rustenberger, I thought they were combined, because every time I saw them, I saw both of them together. And now it's become a committee that I don't think it ever intended to be, and I don't think it should have had at this time. It could have been handled differently. I may disagree with the findings of my Judiciary colleagues and even Intel colleagues, but this should have never been in Intel to start with. And I just disagree inherently with that. There were other committees that could have handled it properly. I just don't think this was where it should be, but I feel like I know why it was, but it just shouldn't have been down there.
Well, and the optics of having this done absolutely in secret in a secure compartmentalized facility downstairs, not just in secret, but behind locked doors with armed guards up front. Well,
and especially when none of it was classified. I mean, that's the whole different issue. I mean, if it was all non-classified, then why do that? And again, I'm not going to. We're late in the day, and I'm tired, and everybody else is tired. There are reasons that it was happening, but they did it for a purpose. They got the intended result. But again, it was not classified. And really, what bothered me was you're talking about the rules. And I talked to the Parliament, the House parliamentarians and others. There was no reason we could have not got that information before it was decided to be released. I'm a member of Congress. I could have went to any of those committees, and I did go to 2 of those committees and was turned down to get that information while it was going on. That was just a flagrant violation of House rules. And you can dress it up and make it look better and say, well, it was all in a bigger cause, but that leads us down some pretty bad roads as well.
And I will tell you, you've been a member of this committee in the past, so you know the responsibility that rests with this committee. Anything that comes to the floor is going to come through us. We set the rules and the parameters around the debate, so it is an important job that is done up here. It certainly has bothered me that all of this activity was done downstairs and in secret, and we weren't allowed, even as a member of the Rules Committee, I was not allowed to review the transcripts until very late in the process. There's a lot of material that was collected. I knew that as a member of the Rules Committee, eventually I was going to be asked to render some sort of judgment, but it was virtually impossible to keep up then with the volume of information that When it came out, there was a lot that came out. You are also doing now your open hearings in both intelligence and then subsequently judiciary. So there was a lot of material with which to keep up. But let me just ask you, were all of the transcripts that were collected down in the Intelligence Committee secure room, were all of those made available to all members of Congress?
No, we still have one, we know of one that is still out that is still lacking. That's the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community's report. And also,
May I ask, is that classified information?
you'd have to ask Mr. Schiff, but he doesn't seem to want to talk about that on the record. So, I mean, he just keeps it, we don't have it. But it also is a violation of 660. It's a violation, clearly violation of 660. The White House, we know, has not got all the information sent to them. That's a clear violation of 660.
When you say 660?
That's House Resolution
The
660.
House resolution that authorized the impeachment
That came out of this
inquiry?
committee, yes. But I want to also say one thing, and again, not to be, not trying to be controversial here, but you just made a statement that should really, frankly, bother every member, no matter what committee they serve on. They could, and I'm not going to take any committee and name them, but you said, I'm a member of the Rules Committee, I couldn't go. Any member who wears a pin has the power and authority to go look at those. And if we can't trust members to go look at those and do that as their job functions, then I really question why are we doing this? I mean, because you can say, well, leaks. Well, golly, that didn't stop the leaks from coming out of the rooms. We had plenty of leaks. But it didn't matter because when you stop members from being members, then inherently, no matter how good your, quote, intention is or how breathless you think that the next election's in peril, the moment you have to take down the liberties and the rights and responsibilities of members to get there, that's a problem.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I should have brought copies of the letters that I sent to the Speaker and to the Chairman of the Intelligence Committee asking to review those documents on a more contemporaneous basis, because again, I knew we were going to get to this day. I knew this day was coming in the Rules Committee. We were going to be asked to vote on stuff that, again, just the sheer volume of information that we now have to sort through in order to make an informed decision for, yes, our constituents, but for other members of the entire House of Representatives, because they are all going to be hanging on what we decide here tonight.
I agree. And I just want to add, because I'm not making this up, and this is for any member of the committee, any member watching right now, this is Clause 2E, 2A of Rule 11. This is a rule of the House. And it was really interesting because they could have waived a lot of this, but they didn't. And this was always available to us, but yet was denied by us on many occasions. And again, it just goes to the, no matter how desperate you are to get to an end result, this is what concerns me this time next year or the next year. When is this going to be brought back up again?
So let me just ask you, Mr. Collins, it seems to me, and in fact, the words in your minority views are that the charges are vague and malleable. And I think my fellow Texan, Mr. Ratcliffe, asked the question during, I think it was during a judiciary hearing, it may have been during an intelligence hearing, what was the crime? Were you aware, in talking to the witnesses, asked witnesses at the witness table, what was the crime that you witnessed? And in general, what answer was he given to that question?
That they witnessed none. And I think what the majority is doing is taking full advantage of the political nature of impeachment in non-defining to move forward with this.
Which, of course, is one of the inherent difficulties going forward. If you allow the charge to proceed that is vague and malleable, it certainly can occur again under different circumstances. A lot has been said today about fact witnesses, and but let me just ask you this. Was there anyone that you interviewed during the Judiciary Committee proceedings that had direct knowledge of the phone call?
I chuckle a little bit because, again, we didn't get to interview anybody. We had 4 law school professors and 2 staff members. That's it. And what was really interesting is we had 2 presentations, one of which, by the way, our witness actually testified. He presented and then had to testify under oath. And then the one who presented for the Judiciary Committee actually then left the presenting table and came and questioned our member under oath and transferred out with the Intelligence Committee staff member. So, no, like I said, I can't lay this out any better, but I want to make it very clear, and I've done this all day. I'll fight you. I'll fight this on process, and I'll fight this on facts. We win both. And I think that's what's, coming out the most in this.
I'm glad you brought about process because we do get a lot of criticism that we're talking a lot of process. This is the Rules Committee. That's kind of what we do, is the process. You remember, you were on the Rules Committee. Well, there's a statement from Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, National Security Advisor to the Vice President, and I'm going to read just a portion of this. I was on the much-reported July 25 call between President Donald Trump and President Zelensky. As an exceedingly proud member of President Trump's administration and a 34-year highly experienced combat veteran who retired with the rank of Lieutenant General in the Army, I heard nothing wrong or improper on the call. I have had no concerns. So was this, I'm assuming this type of information was made available to you while you were conducting your hearing. Is that not correct?
Yeah, he didn't testify. He submitted that.
He submitted. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg's statement into the record.
Without objection.
Well, again, it just goes, you didn't have a testimony from an actual fact witness. As far as we know, no actual crime was elucidated when Mr. Ratcliffe of Texas asked his questions of the witnesses who were there. So it gets to a point where, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And we do need to have a good answer for the American people because they are going to be asking us these questions, and they should ask us these questions. And without an identifiable crime, with people who were present when the telephone call was made, who have significant credentials, and say there was nothing wrong and they witnessed nothing improper, what are people to think?
Well, I agree with your assessment here, and this is one of the reasons we brought out the problems that we've been bringing out. But again, I will also have to say, I've done everything I possibly can do in my side, and I know my colleagues have as well. I'm not going to have to answer that question. Everybody who votes yes tomorrow is going to have to answer that question.
And I think that is an excellent point. Everyone who votes yes tomorrow will have to answer those questions. Let me just ask you one last thing, and it has to do with the transcripts, not the transcripts of the telephone calls, but the fact that phone calls were released as part of and I know it wasn't your report, it was the Intelligence Committee's report that detailed telephone calls. Again, the transcripts of the calls themselves were not revealed, just who made calls to whom. I got to tell you, of all the things that we've encountered in this, that's the one that I've gotten the greatest amount of anxiety back home. People ask me, wait a minute, they intercepted a call from the president's lawyer to the president? I mean, that's pretty serious stuff. They intercepted a call from a member of Congress. And I realize that we're not held in very high regard outside of this room, but still, a member of Congress was listed on that form and not given an opportunity to know about that before their name was listed. That seems to me to be really going too far.
Well, look, and I've said that, and I've testified this before, the subpoenas that were issued are valid subpoenas. They got the numbers, they did the metadata, they got the stuff, and they could match numbers. But to say that there wasn't a determination, as we looked at who these calls and to have those numbers, such as the ranking member, such as a member of the media and others, even if you wanted to, even if you, just grossly in your mind could come to the conclusion it was okay to know that, at what point was it okay to put into that report and not say anything about it? There was no reason to put that in report. I mean, it's the unindicted co-conspirator kind of thing, and I've heard this already. Well, that's even more of a smear on a member of Congress. Well, we didn't really do anything wrong, but that's what we do. No, that should never have happened. There was ways to do it. Mr. Goldman had no answer for that. In fact, he was very uncomfortable because and he told us he wasn't going to talk about how they did their investigation, which is problematic even further because we are the committee. This was our one chance to actually look into how the sort of methodology was that went behind it. And again, I don't want, look, it's very important to members of Congress, and it should be on both sides of the aisle doing that, because at the end of the day, it did not make their case better, it did not make their case stronger, it did not make their case any better, except for the simple fact that all of a sudden, when this report came out, there was about 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 500 media outlets that picked that up. And it just inherited this story of Mr. Nunez and snowballed. And that's, I think, exactly what they wanted. Because, frankly, if I had the report that I had to put out, I'd want something to take attention away from it. And that's sort of what they did. They just threw it in there as a gratuitous that meant nothing. But it just goes to show how rushed and how partisan this has become.
So your
and that
opinion,
should scare everyone.
Your opinion, that was a diversionary tactic?
I think it was a tactic to say, look at what else we've done here, and also look at the ranking member. Let's look at the others. All of this involved. I think it was just simply, again, without going into the mind of Mr. Schiff, who I would actually blame for this, Mr. Goldman not. We don't know. What was your reason for doing that? What was your reason for putting his name in there, except to make a point because y'all have been publicly feuding for a long time about how this process is going? Why else would you put it in there? Because there was no evidentiary value for it.
Well, as a practical matter, let me just share with you, as a rank and file member of Congress, a humble backbencher that I am, we talk about damage to national security. This was damaging to national security. The release of that information and the way it was released was damaging to national security because you and I are going to have to make a determination, and I realize it's not quite the same thing, but the reauthorization of 215 of the Patriot Act is going to come in front of us at some point, and how am I supposed to vote for the collection of amorphous metadata to be held in some place until it's queried by one of our intelligence.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate that. I think it's definitely two conversations to have on a different level, and I agree with your concerns, and I've had similar concerns, but I don't think, my concern more with this is how we treat each other. And I think this is where this hits for me, is how we're treating each other. And not the fact that we can disagree vehemently, and you know, we've had great times up here, and I can remember Mr. Hastings, and I appreciate Ms. Torres talking about our inside voices. Mr. Hastings and I have sometimes not used our inside voices in here. And it's just because we get passionate about what we do, but we've done that. But we disagree vehemently. But I would never think about taking a report that did and put his name in it in a derogatory way that had nothing of value to add to my report. I just wouldn't have thought that. And so if that's the level that we've gotten to, no matter what you believe about the facts, no matter what you believe about the president, the phone call, the transcript, the witnesses, or anything else, to do things like that, to have these gratuitous kind of political, I call it hit job, in the middle of a report that didn't have to be there, that does not benefit you at all, is a problem.
Just one last observation, and I appreciate your comments. We had as you mentioned, you did have one panel of witnesses. There were 4 witnesses, one of which you selected. I do wish you'd selected someone who had actually voted for the president. That would have made me feel better. However, I thought the witness you did select did a very good job. And certainly, I mean, as you recall, he came and testified here to the Rules Committee at one point when we were contemplating a legal action against then President Obama over some part of the Affordable Care Act that we thought had been administered improperly. So I always enjoy listening to Mr. Turley testify. His statement that he's concerned about the lowering of impeachment standards to fit a paucity of evidence and an abundance of anger. I mean, I think those are the words that are going to echo down throughout history. That is what this exercise has been all about. Very little facts and a great deal of anger. Anger at the president, anger at the American people for electing him, and it reverberates over and over and over again. And I've said before in this committee, that is not a good look for us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
And I thank the gentleman, and he had mentioned he had sent several inquiries to our leadership. I think we'll probably be here for a little while longer. If your staff want to collect them, we're more than happy to make them part of the record. And I would also say that those of us who vote yes on impeachment obviously have to answer to our constituents. Those who vote no have to answer to their constituents as well.
I fully agree, Mr.
And these are votes of conscience. I'm voting, I've not been a supporter of the president when he ran for president. That's no secret. But I assure you that my vote for impeachment is based on my strong belief that what he did rises to the level of an impeachable offense. And I genuinely believe, as I've said over and over and over again, that we see a crime in progress, and I'm worried about the next election. And that's why there is urgency here. And I appreciate the conversation you just had. It's all fine and relevant about getting in the weeds over the investigation, but we also need to talk about the president's behavior and what he did. And I now yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I'd like to introduce into the record four things. The oath that the senators have to take of impartiality if they sit as jurors in a trial on impeachment.
Without objection.
Second, a letter from 700 historians, their statement on the impeachment of President Trump.
Without objection.
Third is the editorial from USA Today, dated, I think, December 12th, concerning impeachment of President Trump.
Without objection.
And fourth is a law review article in the Colorado Lawyer by a gentleman named Scott Barker called An Overview of Presidential Impeachment.
Without objection.
Mr. McGovern, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I have a very unusual request, but as a former member, I'd just like to ask. USA Today, I had the response to that editorial in that same paper.
You want to put it in?
Could I put that in as well?
Without objection.
There you go. Thank you very much.
I want to put in my USA Today opinion.
Mr. Perlmutter.
I'd like to read a statement and then ask some questions of my two colleagues here. The president should be impeached. His actions were an abuse of power that jeopardized America's national security and compromised our elections. No one is above the law, and that includes the president. By withholding almost $400 million Ukraine desperately needed to defend itself against Russia until Ukraine did the president's political bidding, the president committed high crimes and misdemeanors for which he should be impeached under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, and Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States of America. This abuse of power is compounded by the president's refusal to cooperate with Congress's impeachment investigation and his stonewalling of witnesses from testifying or turning over documents to Congress. Almost 14,000 people have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine. Withholding $400 million that Congress appropriated to help Ukraine defend itself unless Ukraine helped the president dig up dirt on his political rival, Joe Biden, was the last straw for me. People's lives and our national security were placed at risk. This was more than hush money for strippers or profiting from foreign governments, staying at resort properties, or even obstructing justice, as laid out in the Mueller report. The founders fought and died for freedom and independence from a tyrannical ruler and a foreign government. Impeachment and removal from office was the remedy they included in the Constitution to act as a check on a president who placed himself above the law, abused his power for his own personal benefit, and invited foreign governments to get involved in our domestic affairs, especially our elections. A president who flaunts the separation of powers and checks and balances in our Constitution and who refuses to allow witnesses to appear before Congress would receive our founders' universal condemnation. Treating taxpayer money as his own to extort a, quote, favor from a foreign government to aid him in his reelection goes to the very heart of concerns raised by our nation's founders when they drafted and advocated for impeachment to act as a check on the awesome powers of the chief executive. For instance, Madison said in Federalist 47, quote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. He went on to say during the Constitutional Convention, quote, "The executive will have great opportunities of abusing his power." And further, that a president, quote, "might betray his trust to foreign powers." George Washington's farewell address warned of foreign influence and corruption, which leads to the, quote, "policy and will," close quote, "of America being subjected to the policy and will of another. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 65 that impeachment, quote, "proceeds from the misconduct of public men, from the abuse or violation of a public trust." Following in that, the USA Today editorial board stated it perfectly when they wrote in their December 12, 2019 editorial, quote, "In his thuggish effort to trade American arms for foreign dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter, Trump resembles not so much Clinton as he does Richard Nixon, another corrupt president who tried to cheat his way to re-election. This isn't party politics as usual," they go on to say. "It is precisely the misconduct the framers had in mind when they wrote impeachment into the Constitution." Close quote. Impeachment is the remedy the founders placed in the Constitution to remove a president during his or her term of office. This is especially true when the misconduct involves an upcoming election. The president invited foreign participation in our election at least 3 times. First with, quote, "Russia, if you're listening," close quote. Second, with his demands on Ukraine to, quote, "do us a favor," close quote. And third, with his request for China to get involved in the 2020 election by starting, quote, "an investigation into the Bidens," close quote. Any further delay or simply allowing the election cycle to run its course results in the harm and abuse impeachment was designed to prevent. For the sake of the Constitution, fair elections free of foreign interference, and our national security, President Trump should be impeached. So, obviously, and to my friends, we have very different opinions about this, and we work up here in the Rules Committee a lot of hours. We respect one another. But for me, this goes to the heart of the Constitution. And to my friend, Mr. Collins, you and I couldn't disagree more on this. And I would want to compliment my friend. My guess is that as an attorney, and you kind of come off with that country attorney kind of approach, and a number of us think of ourselves as kind of country attorneys. My first question just is sort of a general proposition to you, sir, and to you, Mr. Raskin. Do you, as an attorney, understand the terminology, time is of the essence? Do you know what that means, Mr. Collins? What does it mean? What's it mean?
It depends on how you want to debate time of this. I need to know it now for a purpose that's not happening if I don't get it.
Because, as you would say, the clock is ticking. Would you agree with that, Mr.
Yes.
Raskin? Okay. Well, the clock is ticking on the 2020 elections. And I think we would all agree that if this impeachment were held in July or August or September, drawn way out, that time is of the essence, that would really affect the 2020 elections. So I appreciate the gentleman's statement that, oh, this has been rushed and there just hasn't been enough time and all of that sort of stuff, but time is of the essence. And this instance began, at least what started it all, and Mr. Hastings introduced this into the record, the memo of July 25th, 2019, which generally transcribes, but not completely transcribes, the President's conversation or parts thereof with President Zelensky. And, you know, we were talking about it, and you used the word transcript, and Mr. Hastings said memo. I mean, it's a memorandum of a telephone conversation, and it's not a verbatim transcript. And then it goes down at the bottom. The word inaudible is used to indicate portions of a conversation that the note-taker was unable to hear. So I'd like to ask you a question, Mr. Collins, and you too, Mr. Raskin. Just in terms of the completeness of this document, because I think that this document, even with things that are not transcribed, is a pretty damning piece of evidence against the president. And then I think Mr. Mulvaney's comments a month later saying, oh, we do this all the time and get over it, that too is damning. But the president says, I would like you, this is right after Mr. Zelensky says, we are ready to continue to cooperate for the next step. Specifically, we are almost ready to buy more javelins from the United States for defense purposes. The president's next words are, our president, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country's been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike ... Gentlemen, in your experience, what does ... mean? Mr. Raskin, I'll start with you.
What do ellipses mean?
Yes. Something's left out.
Well, yeah, so right, but we can say generally that something to be continued, but we don't know specifically what in every case, but you try to deduce it from the context.
And I assume, Mr. Collins, you would agree with that.
To a point, is are not heard, but
Okay.
I will say, in effect, we can
Was
elaborate.
that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. So then it goes on, I guess you have one of your wealthy people, ... The server, comma, they say Ukraine has it. So again, just in that one paragraph, right after President Zelensky says, we're ready to buy the javelins for our defense, there are missing pieces to this memorandum. And it doesn't say the word inaudible is used to indicate portions of a conversation that the note-taker was unable to hear. Does it? In your readings, gentlemen?
No.
I guess that's a no. So this document, and Mr. Burgess was going into the classified nature and why was everybody down in the intelligence room downstairs. Just looking at it on its face, it says, and it's crossed out now, and you apparently it was an inadvertent error, but can you tell me, Mr. Collins, when this memorandum, up at the top there's a cross out, and I think underneath the cross out it says secret / Orcon / no foreign. Do either of you know what that means?
The president declassified the document so it could be made.
What is it? My question was, what is that?
That means that it's not normally put out to public. We don't normally transmit the telephone calls between two world leaders, and our president doesn't do that. And in order of transparency, he did it in this case. That means it's a declassification. There's no.
No, wait a sec. But earlier you said it was an inadvertent error, but now you're saying that, when there are conversations between two foreign leaders, we mark it as secret?
No, you're
or
talking.
Orcon or no foreign?
No, we're talking two different things.
Okay. So, but
You and I
initially
are talking two different things.
Mr. Collins, initially this document was treated as classified and secret, top secret, was it not?
If you let me explain here, because we're talking two
No,
different things. Okay, then we don't. Then I won't answer.
Okay, Mr. Raskin, you go ahead and answer.
So I'm not certain I can completely answer that, Mr. Perlmutter, but can I just try to answer where I think you're going? And here's what I would say about this. There's no mystery here, right? As you stated, Mr. Perlmutter, the July 25th contemporaneous memorandum itself is overwhelmingly damning of the president's designs on President Zelensky. You add that up with everything that came before and everything that came after, and it's all uncontradicted. To me, it looks like it's case closed. Let's talk about July 26th, the next day.
I think that's a good idea.
The day after the July 25 call, the president called Ambassador Sondland. That's his ambassador to the EU, but he's part of the three amigos who are working on getting Zelensky to do the president's will. Okay. He called Ambassador Sondland to ask whether President Zelensky was going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland stated that President Zelensky was going to do it and would do anything you ask him to, and then he famously said, "He loves your ass." According to David Holmes, who overheard the conversation, or part of the conversation, Ambassador Sondland and President Trump spoke only about the investigation in their discussion about Ukraine. There's nothing about the war, nothing about corruption, and so on. And after Sondland hung up the phone, he told Holmes that President Trump, forgive me now, I hope my children are not watching, but he told Holmes that President Trump did not give a shit about Ukraine. Rather, he explained, the president cared only about the big stuff. The big stuff was the stuff that benefited him personally, like, quote, the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pitching. This is not an Agatha Christie mystery. There's no alibi. There's no alternative hypothesis of the facts. The president went after exactly what he wanted. And we know that our president is very capable of stating what he wants and telling people what his will is.
So let's talk about that for a couple seconds, and then I know, Mr. Chairman, you'd like to get moving, but I just have a few more questions. So Holmes, Mr. Raskin, was the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, right?
Correct.
And his job was, I think in his words, quote, gather information about Ukraine's internal politics, foreign relations, security policies, and report back to Washington, represent U.S. policies to foreign contacts, and advise the ambassador on policy development and implementation. I think that comes from his opening remarks.
Yes.
So going back to kind of the questions I was asking Mr. Collins and you about the secret nature of this memo, at least initially, which was unclassified 2 months later. 2 months later. Holmes, I think, testified, quote, contrary to standard procedure, the embassy received no readout of the call and he was unaware of what was discussed until the transcript was released on September 25th. Is that your understanding?
Say that once more.
That he, Holmes, was unaware of what was discussed.
Correct.
Even though it was ordinary procedure that he would get to know something like that until this thing was released 2 months later.
Correct.
And taken out of the top secret server.
That's right. And my recollection is he was not on the July 20th.
Even though it was an supposed inadvertent error to put it in the top secret server. So, you kind of glossed over a couple of the kind of cruder terms that Sondland and was saying in connection with this call between himself and the president. But Holmes, as you said, he could hear, could he not, the phone conversation between Ambassador Sondland and the President Trump.
He could hear it.
Okay, and I think his testimony was Ambassador Sondland went on to state that President Zelensky loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation? Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to. And then your remarks about whether the president cared about Ukraine or not, but his final statement was, I noted that there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia, and Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Giuliani was pushing. So, a couple more things that I think have to be discussed, and that was Mr. Taylor, and you mentioned this. The individuals who testified, and by the way, I'd say to my friend, Mr. Collins, that you said, oh, we didn't get any witnesses. Well, you had Mr. Castor, you had Mr. Turley testified, and then the Intelligence Committee, if I am correct, had at least 3 witnesses that the Republicans called, and I'd agree with Mr. Raskin that these aren't witnesses for or against the defense, although I got to compliment you. I think you've been a heck of a defense counsel so far, because the record's gotten pretty muddy, and, you know, the old saying in law school that I went to, if you don't have a fact, do your best to distract.
I have the truth.
Huh?
I have the truth.
Well, so the three witnesses that the minority called during the investigation, Ambassador Volker, Undersecretary Hale, and Mr. Morrison. So at least 5 witnesses, plus Mr. Raskin, you said that a number of other witnesses were called, like Mr. Bolton and Secretary Pompeo, Mr. Mulvaney, and, you know, so I want the record to reflect that plenty of witnesses were called, and the president has had the opportunity to call witnesses. He was invited, he and his staff were invited to participate in the investigation, were they not?
Yes, indeed.
And they just chose not to.
I mean, we were very disappointed that he chose not to participate, just like we were disappointed when he executed his plan to blockade witnesses from coming and refused to turn over any subpoenaed documents.
Just a comment that came out of testimony by Mr. Taylor, because those individuals that did testify were either decorated war heroes, individuals who've been public servants, working in the intelligence community, the State Department, a whole range of things over the course of decades under both Republicans and Democrats. And Mr. Taylor was one of those. What was his background, if you recall?
He was a Vietnam War hero and had spent his life in first the military service and then the civilian service of the country. And I think he was, if I'm remembering correctly, he was scandalized about the treatment of Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was the target of an unprecedented smear campaign by people working directly with the president, including Rudy Giuliani. She was somebody who worked for America and fought for our foreign policy priorities in Ukraine. She described herself as completely nonpartisan. She had a family background of fleeing persecution from totalitarian regimes. And they just decided to set her up and to describe her as a tool of George Soros and somebody who was on the side of the corrupt and so on, until finally the president decided to recall her and bring her back. That is a scandalous chapter in American history that was allowed to happen to one of our ambassadors. And it was all to clear the way for the shakedown of President Zelensky, because as Mr. Giuliani said today, he's quoted in the paper today, she was in the way of the plan to get from President Zelensky what the president wanted.
Last thing, in Ambassador Taylor's testimony, he was talking about conversations with Ambassador Sondland. And in that conversation, Ambassador Taylor said, quote, President Trump had told him, Sondland, he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. election. In fact, Ambassador Sondland said everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. He said that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a box making public statements about ordering such an investigation. So that, earlier you referred to putting
That's
President
absolutely right.
Zelensky.
And you know, if I had to pick one quote for people to remember from Ambassador Taylor, it's when he said, as I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. And that was in a text message that he was engaged in. I believe that was with Sondland and Volker. I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. That was on September 9th, 2019.
Last questions I'd like to ask you is concerning Mr. Giuliani, who you just mentioned. And in that Taylor deposition, there is a reference to a New York Times report concerning Mr. Giuliani's role. And it's a report from May 9th, 2019, which says, quote, or an article, Mr. Giuliani said he plans to travel to Kiev the Ukrainian capital in the coming days to meet with the nation's president-elect to urge him to pursue inquiries that allies of the White House contend could yield new information about two matters of intense interest to Mr. Trump. One is the origin of the special counsel's investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. The other is the involvement of former Vice President Joe Biden's Jr.'s son in a gas company owned by a Ukrainian oligarch. So this is in May of 2019. The ambassadors were told they should work with Mr. Giuliani, and their testimony, again, from the Sondland deposition is they were disappointed by the president's direction that we involve Mr. Giuliani. Our view was that men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for all aspects of U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Well, Mr. Sondland, and I don't know who came up with the name Three Amigos, apparently referring to Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, and Ambassador Perry. They had a couple choices. They could work with Mr. Giuliani or not. And in his testimony, Mr. Sondland says, in working with Mr. Giuliani, that, quote, all communications flowed through Rudy Giuliani. He determined in his testimony, he said, this turned out to be a mistake. But I did not understand until much later that Mr. Giuliani's agenda might have included an effort to prompt Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign. Do you recall that testimony?
Whose statement was that? That was
From the Sondland deposition at page 16, 297.
Yeah, I recall reading that. Yes.
Well, the articles that the Judiciary Committee has brought talk about an abuse of power, talk about betrayal of national security, talk about corruption. Are these the kinds of pieces of evidence that support the articles that your committee drafted that you would like the whole House to vote on tomorrow?
Yes. It was a vote of 23 to 17 in committee. The majority felt we were brought to the inescapable conclusion that the President of the United States had abused his power in sweeping and systematic ways for personal purposes by bringing a foreign government into our elections in order to alter our political destiny as a people. And he proceeded to obstruct justice in order to cover that up. That's a pattern that we saw, again, from the 2016 campaign. And the president has demonstrated his unrepentance. He has pronounced his behavior perfect and absolutely perfect, and assures us that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the power to do whatever he wants to do. So we have a very clear choice as a country right now.
Well, and to end with that, in fact, I think the president actually said a couple days before the conversation with Mr. Zelensky that Article 2 of the Constitution allows him to, quote, do whatever I want as president, close quote. And I think that's the problem. That's the core of the issue, that we are in a democratic republic, that we have a framework of laws, of checks and balances, that limit a president from doing something like that, or to entangle other governments in our politics and in our domestic affairs. And that is why we brought these articles of impeachment, and that's why I'm going to vote for them tomorrow. I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter, before you yield back, because I always like to answer, because I'm going to answer this question one way or the other, and I'd love to answer it with you.
Sure.
Going back to our original. And The two issues we hear that you said not foreign, that's not for foreign sharing. That was what's always listed on these. You're going
So
back to
now
your
you are
document.
going to have to speak a little slower for me.
Yeah, no problem. The documents.
I
the
haven't
documents-
interrupted you before, but
No,
please.
you did fine. And that was it was mine. What I wanted to make sure was my clarification of my answer and out of respect for your question. It was
Okay.
two separate things that we were talking about. I was talking about that Mr. Morrison said that it was put on the other server by an administrative mistake. All of these conversations that they have with foreign leaders are marked the way that one is marked unless the president himself declassifies it. That not for sharing with foreign government, that's that not foreign on there. Then you also have the secret classification, which was struck through because he declassified it.
All right, so
And
that
yeah.
brings, so I appreciate, thank you for clarifying that. So in his testimony, Mr. Holmes also said that it was unusual for him not to get a readout. I think the term was readout of the call. Do you know whether that was unusual or not, or
Yeah.
you just have to accept his testimony?
That would be his testimony. It's not something that I would
Okay.
could comment on.
And
But
no,
I just wanted to
and I
clarify.
thank
I
you
wanted
for-
to do it with you because I can do it in a minute, but I want to do it with you just to have that
All
kind
right,
of.
and I thank you for clarifying
No
your
problem.
answer. I
Thank
yield
you.
back to the gentleman.
Happy to yield to the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, who not only has the privilege of serving on the Rules Committee and sitting through this hearing today, but also on the Judiciary Committee. So
I know.
Yeah.
I'm going to dream impeachment in my arguments, I think. Although to me, it's a nightmare, quite frankly. Mr. Chairman, before I start asking questions, and I have several of them, sorry, Mr. Collins and Mr. Raskin, I would like to ask unanimous consent to include my statement on these articles of impeachment into the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. Chairman, I also ask to unanimous consent to include President Trump's letter to Speaker Pelosi into the record.
Without objection, and I was going to do it at the end, but you beat me to it, so.
I beat you to it.
I think it's important to have that part of the record, after having just read it. Yeah.
All right. Before I get into my questions, I just want to, I thought it was very interesting. I had staff look up votes on impeachment. And Chairman McGovern, at the beginning, in your, I believe, opening statement, you said something to the effect that no Democratic congressman or woman on the Rules Committee has voted for the articles of impeachment before. I think that's
Yeah.
what you said, right?
I did.
And, boy, I think that's a little disputable or maybe a little misleading, I'm not sure. But I can tell you, I have here the final vote result for, it was H Resolution 646, and it was dated December 6, 2017. 58 Democrats, including many on this committee, voted to advance an article of impeachment for the high crime or misdemeanor of dissing the NFL anthem protests and calling a member of Congress wacky. This was a House resolution that Mr. Perlmutter introduced, and all 9 of the Democratic members on the Rules Committee voted to table it, which means that if this was, or against tabling it, I'm sorry, let me clarify, against tabling it, which means if it wasn't tabled, you would have voted on the floor of the House of Representatives to impeach the
Well,
President of the
if the
United
gentlelady would yield
States.
just for a correction, I mean, the intent was to vote to advance it to the Judiciary Committee. Because that is, you know, I voted against tabling because I wanted to send it to the Judiciary Committee where I thought that was the appropriate way to deal with it. So, I mean, so I stand by what I said. Nobody in this House has yet voted on an article of impeachment. And tomorrow will be, assuming we give them a rule, will be the first time that anybody, Democrat or Republican, will have that opportunity. But thank you for letting me clarify the record.
And thank you. And with all due respect, I asked my staff that, because you had said that in your opening statement, and I said, is that accurate? And they said, no, that would be if there was a referral. This was actually articles of impeachment on the floor of the House of Representatives that if it had not been tabled, you actually would have been voting on the floor of the House of Representatives for articles of impeachment against the president. The one that was on December 6, 2017, was because you didn't like that President Trump said something negative about the NFL anthem protest and called a member of Congress wacky, and all nine of you here voted against tabling that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, if I could just interrupt, I don't think Ms. Scanlon, myself, or Ms. Shalala were members of the House.
I was on the wrong one. I apologize. Thank you for pointing that out to me. This one was Mr. McGovern, Hastings, Raskin, and DeSaulnier voted against tabling. So there's another one where it's all nine. So I missed
Tabling
that.
what? What are we talking about? Impeachment or?
Yes, it was House Resolution 646. It was, the staff has told me, they were articles of impeachment on the floor of the House of Representatives. And Representative McGovern, Hastings, Raskin, and DeSaulnier voted against tabling, meaning that if it wasn't tabled, you would have been able to vote on the floor for articles of impeachment. Then on January 19th, 2018, House Resolution 705, and I have this one right here, 66 Democrats, including many on this committee, voted to advance impeachment for the high crime or misdemeanor of President Trump's rhetoric. And on that one, Mr. McGovern, Hastings, Raskin, and DeSaulnier all voted against tabling. So meaning that if it wasn't tabled, there would have been a vote. Then on this one, more recent.
Well, let me just, generally, if there was a vote, you don't know how we would have voted on it. I mean, I appreciate it, but I mean, and I just would, and again, you can go on.
Right.
You'd like, I would just simply say that, we could have this conversation. It has nothing to do with the articles of impeachment that are before us right now, but I'm happy to.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. A lot of what has been said today hasn't had anything to do with articles of impeachment. But this, I believe, does, because it proves to me that it was predetermined that you're going to impeach the President of the United States, and you're just searching around for anything to impeach him on. So, impeachment number 3. On July 17th, 2019, House Resolution 498, 95 Democrats, including many chairmen and many members of this committee. In fact, let's see, I have Mr. McGovern, Torres, Raskin, Scanlon, DeSaulnier, all voted against tabling, voted to advance impeachment for the high crime or misdemeanor of insulting the squad. And so, Mr. Collins, my question to you is, do you think the fact that so many of our Democratic colleagues, both 17 out of 24 Judiciary Committee members that are Democratic, and here a number of my Democratic colleagues on the Rules Committee voted to move forward articles of impeachment prior to the July 25th, 2019 phone call that the Democrats are using as their central case for impeaching the president? Do you think that that kind of undermines their argument?
As I stated earlier today, I do believe it is true, and we've seen this over time.
And Mr. Collins, do you also think that moving articles of impeachment against the president because he dissed the NFL anthem protests, against his rhetoric, and against insulting the squad kind of lower the bar for impeachment?
I think we've seen a lot of those things that's happened in the last, this Congress and last Congress as well. I think a lot of this does. I think this lowers the bar for impeachment. I think it's just something that we're having to plow through at this point. And, again, they have the votes and they'll move it forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Collins, earlier, much earlier, Mr. Raskin had said something. He was comparing how the closed-door hearings that Adam Schiff did were comparable to what Ken Starr did in the Clinton impeachment, but isn't it true that we Republicans on the Judiciary Committee asked to have Mr. Schiff testify like Ken Starr did, and the Democrats refused us?
Yes.
Thank you. And I also want to I think you already addressed this, Mr. Collins, but another statement Mr. Raskin said earlier was there was no evidence Trump tried to root out corruption prior to Joe Biden becoming candidate or something to that effect. And I just, from what I've heard, that's absolutely false, and I wanted to hear what you said. I was told that Trump actually had a meeting with the former Ukrainian Poroshenko concerned about corruption in Ukraine prior to giving him aid, and also that two of the witnesses, Democrat witnesses, testified that all along Trump was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. Is that accurate?
That was the testimony of the witnesses, yes.
Thank you. And also, another thing that I want to clear up for the record, Mr. Raskin said previously that this same process that we're doing now was done, it's the same process that was used in the Clinton impeachment. Mr. Collins, do you agree with that? Because I sure don't.
No, I do not.
And would you care to expand?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different things here, and again, I think it goes back to the inherent nature of what we're dealing with today, and that is frankly, the only bipartisan nature of this impeachment is no. It's not bipartisan in the sense of seeing it should go forward. It's bipartisan in no, and that'll be the only bipartisan that you'll see tomorrow. Now, again, my friends across the aisle will say that they're standing for truth, and I get that, and that's fine. That's their argument. My argument will be that it's, you know, everything that we've talked about so far. And that's also why at a certain point in time we continue to go on here. But I think when you look at the actual things that were going on, you know, the issues of how witnesses are called, how you dealt with an outside counsel, and again, it was also said earlier that the Judiciary Committee handled the STAR faster than this. That's not true. It was longer than this going through when it got to Judiciary. There were several, I mean, there was 2.5 weeks set up before the first impaneling of scholarly witnesses. I mean, so we never had that. We didn't have barely 2.5 weeks of the entire thing. So when you look at it from those perspectives, I think there's just, again, I have argued here today, and I feel comfortable in my argument today that I've argued both the process problems and the factual problems. I've not been afraid to back away from either. We can genuinely disagree with that. That's why we're here tonight. If we didn't disagree with this, we wouldn't be here. So I think, you know, moving this forward at a late hour and just discussing the facts that this is, you know, an issue we have. I will say something that it needs clarification. Again, I know from my Democratic friends it will not matter, but it does, I think, need to be at least added to the record. And it's been brought up that Mr. Mulvaney on several times, you know, on his comments on that was the way it's done, get over it. It was also referring to general conditions placed on foreign aid to all countries, and he did clarify his statement later. If we've gotten to the point where we can't clarify statements, and I get that, because if it doesn't fit the narrative, we don't do that, then we do have an issue and a problem, because there's not a one of us on this in here at the witness table or at the dais that has not misspoke at some point in their life, and you know, possibly even today. So I mean, we just have to look at it from that perspective and go forward. Look, I think I've made all the points that I think, frankly, we can make. I would love to have seen this done differently. It does concern me that the future is now predicated on this, and as like I said, it's just a concern that the bar is at a certain point now to where it is anything you want it to make it. It's always been a concern, but the founders were concerned about many things from foreign influences to everything, but they were also very concerned about this being an overreach in the branches that impeachment, you know, could be used this in a partisan way, or or as the quote actually was, is whoever had the most votes, basically, who was stronger in their majority. Well, and that's very true in the House, and I think that's why it is resting in the House. That's why I agree with my friend on the Constitution side. It rests in the House for a reason, because it's the same reason taxes and spending have to originate here. We're the closest to the people to actually do this. So I think this is normal that impeachment would be here. I just don't want it to become that is frankly this, you don't even have to jump to clear the bar anymore. And I think that's the concern I have about impeachment is going forward now.
Thank you. I'm going to actually turn to the actual bill, and I'm on page 2 now under Article 1, Abuse of Power. And I read, the Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. So, Mr. Collins, I have a question for you. Were any of the Democrats' fact witnesses able to establish that the President committed treason, bribery, or high crimes or misdemeanors?
No, and not in the sense of the way that was laid out. And again, and I've made this comment earlier, and I appreciate the gentlelady for bringing this up. They're not depending on a crime. Okay, and that's fact, and they're willing to admit that. I freely give that. They're not depending on a crime. They're depending on a pattern of acts and abuse of power is what they're calling it. The interesting thing is, though, is in the report themselves, they mentioned bribery and extortion and all these other things, but they just couldn't bring it up to actually, to get the elements, if you would, to be, crass criminal about it. That they couldn't get the elements to where they could explain it to the American people and what they were doing.
Thank
At least in
you.
my opinion, personally.
Thank you, Mr. Collins, and I'm going to be asking you several questions. So then further down on page 2, the Democrats are claiming, which I think is inaccurate, using the powers of his high office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. Mr. Collins, was there any mention of the 2020 election in the phone call?
No.
And Mr. Collins, has there been any proof or evidence or witness or anyone that can prove that Mr. Trump was referring to the 2020 election?
No, and the only testimony that, that it really was never to that. It was discussing on aid and conditions on aid that they tried to put forward.
And then on the bottom of page 2 into page 3, it says that it alleges, again, I think a lot of this is a wishful thinking fairy tale going on here by my Democratic colleagues. It said it would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. Again, has there been any proof of that, Mr. Collins?
No, and it did raise the question that's never still been answered from earlier today is now by running for president, you're free to do whatever you want to and not be investigated overseas.
Thank you. And then the other thing that is repeatedly said in these articles of impeachment is that Trump had corrupt purposes or corrupt intent. Has there been any proof from their witnesses, from anyone, that Trump's intent or purposes were corrupt?
Depending on how you're wording that question, no. And I think the interesting issue is how they would presume what his intentions were in those phone calls. And those were presumptions or beliefs given to them by someone else. But it goes back to the fact Mr. Sunderland himself said it was presumed, and then when talked to the president himself, said, I don't want anything. I just want him to do the job that he ran for.
Exactly, and I have said before in Judiciary Committee and elsewhere that there's no way that you can prove what was on Trump's mind or that he had corrupt intent, because there are other logical explanations. Even though, Mr. Raskin, earlier you said there was no other logical explanations. Yes, indeed, there is, because there was proof, or I should say, there is evidence that President Trump was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. He also said in his phone call that he was very concerned that other European countries weren't pitching into Ukraine. He also talked about the video of Joe Biden bragging about how he got a prosecutor fired by saying he's going to withhold $1 billion from Ukraine. So to me, those are all logical explanations of why President Trump would want to talk about that, not some nefarious reason.
Well, and I think...
And so...
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Mr. Collins?
I apologize.
Did you want to add something?
No, I thought you were through. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Also, let's see. Oh, this is a good one. This gets under my skin, so I guess that's why you guys keep using it. Is on page 3 at the bottom, my Democratic colleagues in Judiciary Committee and here in the impeachment, they keep on saying that it says A discredited theory, we're talking about Ukraine now, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 election. Mr. Collins, did Republicans I don't think President Trump ever said that, ever say that Russia was never involved? Or did we just say that it's possible that both could have influenced the 2016
Well, we've never
election?
said, I mean, I believe Russia's been involved in elections, not only in ours, but others for years. That's never been and it really is one of the disturbing parts, and I know we have some disagreement between my judiciary colleagues. It was one of the main things that come out of the Mueller report that was genuinely we both understood, but we never dealt into that legislatively. We dealt with it in some of our elections, and maybe touched on it. I'll give that much to some of the bills that we passed, but we didn't really dig into it in depth. But I think the issue is Fiona Hill and others, had talked about the Ukrainians, and I'll say that individuals, who did side with Clinton. And Fiona Hill's, her own statement was the Ukraine, in her words, were Ukraine bet on the wrong horse. But again, this goes to a whole, a discussion that we've had on this. And at this point, it's become very clear. We've talked about this over and over and over. These are the facts, that we look at it. I think it is interesting that you would say that I hear this a good bit, that these are undisputed facts. They are disputed, inherently disputed, because if we didn't have undisputed facts, we'd all be agreeing here. And that's not true. We don't agree on the basis for the fact. We don't believe on the basis of the motivation of the call. We don't believe that is, and that's an inherent difference in the two sides. That's why we're here.
Will the gentlelady yield for unanimous consent request?
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record at this time a November 8th political article entitled, quote, "Ukraine didn't interfere in the 2016 campaign, Trump officials testified."
Yep, and I appreciate the gentleman putting that in the record, but again, for my 14th time, I think today, I've not said Ukraine, I said Ukrainians. Individual Ukrainians. So there's a difference. There's the United States, and they're Americans who may do something, but it's not the American government. And I think this is the point that I've tried to make, during the rest of this, during the hearing today.
Yeah, and in fact, there was, I think it was op-eds, guest columns written by Ukrainian officials that were against President Trump, if my memory serves me correctly. Not to belabor this too much, but I think it's important to get this all on the record. On page 4 of the Articles of Impeachment, it claims that things were he conditioned 2 official acts on public announcements that he had requested. Again, Mr. Collins, is there any proof of that?
No, it's not. I mean, but we went through this over and over. I mean, and again, one of the questions that came up is they're going to box him in. Box him in so that he had a public stance on corruption. He just got elected, and like all of us, we have members, you want to make sure that he's making the stance, not only what he ran on, but also he's going to actually do it, because if you actually do it, say it, you can do it. This is, again, a concern about the corruption issue that we brought up before.
And I would just, so I'm not repeating myself, there was over and over again in here, it says openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. As you noted, Chairman McGovern, I serve on the Judiciary Committee. I went over transcripts. I, listened to as much live testimony as I could. I was rejected from actually going into the Mr. Skiff's room so that I could cross-examine witnesses, which was very disheartening and I think very unfair. But again, there's no proof. There's no proof of this. It's like wishful thinking or something. It's like what you want. And as Mr. Collins said in these the Nadler report, I mean, it throws out all kinds of stuff. It talks about bribery, which isn't even in the articles of impeachment here. So obviously, you didn't have much proof on that. And you just keep throwing out these things. All right, let's move to Article 2, obstruction of Congress. Mr. Collins, can you kind of explain what the normal procedure, what has been done in the past when the legislative branch wants something from the executive branch? My understanding is they first pursue accommodations, like they talk with each other to see what they can come up with, and then if they run into a roadblock, then one of them goes to court and they get a ruling Is that your understanding? And did the House Democrats pursue any accommodations? And if there was a roadblock, did they take the time to go to court, or did they just move forward with articles of impeachment instead?
Again, it's a whole year process, but if you just want to talk about the last couple of months, whenever they would call a witness or the witness would not, wouldn't come, in a couple of cases, the witness actually went to court to determine, should they testify or not, given their position, and the House majority withdrew from the suit. I mean, so they didn't want to continue that process in court. Historically, and look, it's if you take the majority's argument on face value that there is a time issue here, that there is an election issue that is a clear and present danger, as they've actually said many times, then you'd want to avoid something that could drag this out further. I get that. But this is not historically the way this is done. It's not historically, even investigations of impeachments have been done. Those took long, several years, the Nixon, the Clinton. I mean, there were investigations for a long time into these things as we go along. Remember, though, we were tied up for the first half of the year in Mueller, and then we got out of Mueller in July, and we went basically straight into this, right after it. So this has been the situation we're in.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I'm now going to turn to what I call the Nadler report, which was kind of dumped on us at, I don't think it was midnight last night. It was after midnight the night before, 658 pages. So I was frantically trying to read through it while I was in different committees. But Mr. Collins, at the beginning of this, it says, to me, this was laughable, I have to admit. It says, from start to finish, the House conducted its inquiry with a commitment to transparency, efficiency, and fairness. The minority was present and able to participate at every stage. Boy, Mr. Collins, do you think that's true?
Well, I think they're talking about what they witnessed and not what they did. I think this is the interesting part of this, is getting it from our committee and being a rubber stamp for what somebody else did. Grant, I'm not going to, and I've not denied that there was not witnesses that testified in the Intelligence Committee, and also that, and I never have not been one of the members who said that we didn't have our time. We had, our members actually discussed, our councils discussed that those were actually testimonial times. I did think it was really interesting that, and this I think shows the sort of the craziness of this. I think it was, and I think it was Mr. Perlmutter, but I'm not sure. Actually brought up Mr. Castor. Mr. Castor's a staff member, being our witness. And the only reason Mr. Castor was a witness is because Mr. Schiff wouldn't testify, because Mr. Nunez should have been sitting in that seat. And actually, he was at the beginning of the hearing. He was behind Mr. Castor. So, I mean, I don't agree with it in any shape or form. But the discussion that you just read is viewing another committee, not our own. Because once it got to us, as I was found out today, and I'm hoping it was a misspeak, and I assume from my friend it probably was, that only 17 members that were called was the ones we could have actually called. I'm going to assume that was a misspeak. But also, it's really interesting when you're dealing in such magnitude as an impeachment that you actually allow the chairman of the committee, and then by virtue of a majority vote, determine their relevance. When no idea, and not even a question was determined, could this provide exculpatory opinion? Could it provide anything that would go further in this process? Just simply say those witnesses are not relevant. And really what, I never had to get a letter from Chairman Nadler about that, because I could see the timing of, I'm also been around this game long enough, you have to notice hearings. And the way we were noticing hearings, there was not enough time to notice the next hearing if you had to put in either a minority hearing day, or you had to add witness day, or the president you just didn't have the time. Because when they started actually noticing hearing, sometimes, like I said, it's just a simple fact you can look that you're not going to get the witnesses. It didn't matter. I could have put anybody on there and it wouldn't have mattered, because they didn't have the time. They'd already scheduled the hearings, out when they got it back. So that's just a concern. It just goes into the general concern I have about where do we go in this body, in this House, come January 1? Because it'll be long gone from us tomorrow. But where are we going to be on January 1? We all have to get together. We all have to work together. We all have to look forward. And then who sits in these seats after this time happens? And that's just the general concern that a lot of us have. You'll get the majority will get what they want. And that's fine. But is that in long-term benefit, not only to what they wanted to accomplish, but also the long-term benefit of this body? I would have to say no.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to close with something that I've said before in Judiciary Committee, and at the risk of repeating it, it's, I guess, an oldie but a goodie, in my opinion. And so it's actually Chairman Nadler's own words, and I want to repeat. So during an interview on MSNBC's Morning Joe on November 26, 2018, so not that long ago, Chairman Nadler outlined a three-pronged test that said would allow for a legitimate impeachment proceeding. Now, and I quote, "There are really three questions, I think. First, has the president committed impeachable offenses? I believe the answer is no, and there has been no proof. Second, do these offenses rise to the gravity that's worth putting the country through the drama of impeachment? Again, I would say no, because there has been no evidence of any crime committed, or that no evidence put forward. They were not able to establish treason, bribery, or any high crimes or misdemeanors. And three, because you don't want to tear the country apart. You don't want half of the country to say to the other half for the next 30 years, we won the election, you stole it from us. You have to be able to think at the beginning of the impeachment process that the evidence is so clear, of offenses so grave, that once you've laid out all the evidence, a good fraction of the opposition, voters, will reluctantly admit to themselves they had to do it. Otherwise, you have a partisan impeachment, which will tear the country apart. If you meet those three tests, then I think you do the impeachment." Well, in all three counts, I don't think Mr. Nadler has met his test, and especially in the last one, even if you can test the other ones, this has been a partisan impeachment. Not one Republican voted to move forward with House Resolution 660 to move forward with the inquiry. Not one Republican in Judiciary Committee voted for the articles of impeachment. I suspect not one Republican will vote to move this forward in rules tonight, and I suspect that not one Republican will vote for these articles of impeachment on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And, Mr. Chairman and members, this is tearing the country apart. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of a stickler for details and accuracy in terms of some of the things that have been said here, because these hearings are going to be enshrined in, in our files, and they'll be there forever. But I want to go back to something the gentlewoman said about the votes on impeachment. I repeat, nobody, Democrat or Republican, has had an opportunity to vote on articles of impeachment. And contrary to what has been said, voting to not table doesn't mean you get an automatic vote on the impeachment. I'll give you an example. On November 6, 2007, the House rejected a motion to table a Kucinich resolution to impeach Vice President Cheney, and then moved to adopt a motion to refer the resolution to the Judiciary Committee. And that's what most of us had in mind. So I can't say everybody, but I can say that it is just inaccurate to say that people would have automatically voted for impeachment, or that voting not to table would mean a vote, an automatic vote on impeachment. I just think it's important for the record to be clear. And having said that, it has nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with what we're talking about here today. And I appreciate the fact that the gentlewoman is not fazed by the overwhelming evidence and the president's behavior, but some of us genuinely are, and many of our constituents are. And I think that is what compels us to be here today. And with that, I want to yield to the...
Chairman, my name was involved. I'd like to say something.
Ms. Torres.
Yes, so in reference to this squad, I'm not sure why members and the president continue to pick on them the way they do. Not that I need to defend any of them, because I think they do a great job defending themselves. But I believe that the tweet that caused that resolution from the President of the United States actually states, go back to the countries where you came from, referring to American citizen members of Congress. If that's not despicable racism that will continue to be tolerated by some members of our caucus, I don't know what it is. And I yield back.
And I appreciate that. I think the concern many of us have is the bar has been so lowered that we're justifying and defending the indefensible. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin, I saw you sitting up in your seat over a couple questions, so I just wanted to ask if you'd care to comment on the question about whether the conduct alleged in the articles is not just a constitutional crime, but also a statutory crime that could be criminally prosecuted.
Well, yes, of course. And, you know, there are a whole series of crimes in the middle of the Venn diagram, which are both high crimes and misdemeanors and also possibly statutory crimes. But it has never been the understanding of any Congress, whether it was the Congress, the House of Representatives that impeached Bill Clinton, or the House of Representatives that brought articles against Richard Nixon, or back to Andrew Johnson, that you need first to prove a statutory offense before the House gets to move articles of impeachment. And you can understand how nonsensical that is, because it's impossible to square with the other argument we've heard so long from our colleagues, which is that the Department of Justice may not, under any circumstances, prosecute, try, or convict a president while he's in office, whatever the merits of that proposition, and I do think they deserve greater scrutiny, whatever the merits of them, how can you say the president cannot be prosecuted under any circumstances because he can be impeached? It's only Congress can impeach him, and then when there's an impeachment investigation, then it is being said, you must first prove that he's committed a crime. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's a game of three-card Monte. All of it essentially supports the president's own claim that he is basically above the law. I mean, he says that under the Constitution, he can do whatever he wants. And so I think that all of us should beware for all time of making arguments that put the president in a different kind of box, a box that is above the Constitution and above the people. That's going to be really dangerous for us.
Okay. I also wondered if you could address the fact, it has struck me that with respect to this call to the president of the Ukraine that occurred on July 25th, that we didn't hear any rationale, no witness has testified that there was any legitimate national security or any rationale for that call until after the whistleblower blew the whistle on that call. So there were no contemporaneous conversations. Could you address that point?
Well, Ms. Scanlon, you're absolutely right. All of these are after-the-fact concoctions and rationalizations that don't square with any of the evidence that we have on the record. And when I say evidence, I'm talking about the evidence that has actually been submitted to Congress through people's sworn testimony. I'm not talking about the kind of stuff that people just put on social media or a tweet. I'm talking about real evidence. So what do we know? Well, if the president was concerned about continuing corruption in Ukraine, why did he cut anti-corruption funding to Ukraine in half? If he was concerned about fighting corruption in Ukraine, why did he recall the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who was the lead champion of the anti-corruption effort there? And why did he recall her under circumstances where she was under attack by people who were working with the retrograde corrupt forces in Ukraine as part of this smear campaign? That's a really serious problem when you think about it. In any event, Congress passed the aid to go to the reformer president, the anti-corruption president, President Zelensky. We attached stringent anti-corruption criteria, which were satisfied according to President Trump's own Department of Defense, according to President Trump's own Department of State. The money was on his way, and then he held it up because everyone knows why he held it up. He held it up because he wanted these statements, these announcements from President Zelensky that had to do with Joe Biden and trying to overthrow our intelligence community's understanding that it was Russia that had interfered in our presidential campaign in 2016, instead replacing Ukraine. Well, that again is nonsensical. But none of that appears on the record anywhere. We asked lots of witnesses. They also said, for example, oh, the president was concerned about burden sharing Actually, the European countries, the EU member countries have given billions of dollars to Ukraine, $12 billion to Ukraine. How insulting is that for us to go around saying, as a way to justify our president's behavior, oh, they weren't doing enough for Ukraine? The EU member countries put up $12 billion, and I'm proud of the more than $1 billion that we put in over the last few years, but that's not as much as the EU member countries collectively put in. So we'd rather pick a fight with our own democratic allies and say they're not doing enough, even though Ambassador Sondland himself testified, the president's own ambassador testified when we asked him, did the president ever say to you, go to the EU member countries and tell them they need to increase their funding? No, never happened. There's no record of the president doing anything to try to get them to put more money in. It's an after-the-fact rationalization. It's a pretext, and it's beneath the dignity of this body for us to keep spreading this as some kind of plausible rationale for the president's behavior. If you don't think it's a big deal for the president of the United States to shake down foreign governments and pressure them to get involved in our campaigns, just tell us so, but don't make up all of these other fairy tale explanations for what was going on.
Okay, and contrary to these after-the-fact rationalizations, in fact, we have contemporaneous witnesses like Ambassador Sondland and others who said, no, it was clear that what was important to the president was getting this personal political favor.
I mean, the president himself said when asked in public what would he have the Ukrainians do, he basically said the same thing, just like his chief of staff admitted it. This stuff is happening in plain sight. Let's stop playing pretend. We've got a very heavy decision to make about what to do with the president who enlists and recruits foreign governments to get involved in our elections. Is that what democracy is going to be like for the rest of the 21st century? Is that what it's going to be like for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? We've got to decide that. You know, Dr. Fiona Hill, in her testimony, said, Russia can't beat us militarily. Russia can't beat us economically, but they've got a strategy that involves the internet and intervention in elections around the world. She said she thinks of Russia as the world's largest super PAC, right? And are we going to be allowing the President of the United States to be working with Vladimir Putin's super PAC for the tyrants and the despots and the people who are trying to interfere with the growth and the spread of democracy around the world? I hope not.
Well, I wanted to spend a couple minutes just looking at the real fundamental question here before us, which is, should these articles of impeachment move forward? And Mr. Collins, I understand from the dissenting views from the minority that you think it's too vague to charge with abuse of power here. And I also understand that you accept that abuse of power can form the basis for an impeachment, correct?
Yes.
But as I understand it, the objection is that you need more concrete facts. So I'd like to just explore for a minute what concrete facts could get you, if any, could get you over that bar. So if a president were to send our troops to war in exchange for a personal cash payment, that would be impeachable, wouldn't it?
I think what we're going to go down a road here of hypotheticals that frankly I'm just not going to play with. And I mean, there will be things that you and I can both agree.
Reclaiming my time.
That's fine.
Mr. Raskin, in fact, that was a hypothetical that the framers of the Constitution looked at, wasn't it?
Do you mind repeating?
Sure, that the executive can't interfere with that, yes. Yes. When the framers were looking at what kinds of offenses should be impeachable, didn't they look to the example of an executive who was being paid off by a foreign country?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all four witnesses all said that. And when they canvassed all of the records of the Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions and the Federalist Papers, and everybody can retrace their steps themselves, and I encourage you to do it because we've got to use this episode as a civics lesson for America. When you retrace it, you will find that there were three kind of things on their mind. One was a president who tries to corrupt our elections. Two was a president who makes deals with foreign powers in order to alter the course of our political destiny. In other words, taking choice away from we the people and giving it to foreign despots and spies and people who would not have our best interests at heart, basically. And the third thing was the president elevating his own personal, financial, and political interests over the common good. And, I really want to emphasize that point because the framers wanted the President of the United States to have complete and undivided loyalty to the American people, and not foreign powers, and not his or her own financial plans, and certainly not elevating his or her own electoral ambitions over the rule of law, such that he or she would be willing to corrupt elections just to get reelected. And George Mason famously asked, is there anybody who really should be above justice? And especially the person who himself has the more means of injustice. And so we have more to fear from the president because of his awesome powers. How can we say then that he should be beyond the reach of the law?
Well, that's one of the things I found really interesting as we've gone through this, listened to the experts. I did want to ask unanimous consent, and I'm not sure which letter Mr. Perlmutter introduced before, but we do have a letter now that has 500 legal scholars who've signed on saying that there's grounds for impeachment in our current fact situation, and over 700 historians who have signed a separate letter. So I'm not sure which one. Okay. But so I wanted to explore a little bit, and I'm sorry if Mr. Collins doesn't want to do this. Perhaps he'd consider another question, because I'm trying to find, do we have any common ground here with respect to what might be impeachable? So if the president ordered the government to withhold payment from a contractor building his wall on the southern border unless the contractor paid the president $1 million, would that be an impeachable abuse of power?
With all due respect to the gentlelady who is very talented in law, if we want to talk about the issue at hand, I'll be happy to. But I think we're way past the point here at Rules Committee to determine, because we've already issued the articles of impeachment. And I think, and in all due respect, we're just getting it to the floor. And I'll discuss as I have the facts of this case, which I just disagree with, and we both disagree, and I respect that greatly. I'm not going to just chase what is impeachable offense. I wish the majority had done that a long time ago. So,
Well, okay,
but
reclaiming
I'm not,
my
but
time,
I appreciate it. You can go back to it.
I think, the minority's report says that you don't think the abuse of power allegation here is concrete enough. So I'm trying to figure out what, if anything, you might think is concrete. How about if the facts showed that the president had ordered our government to withhold foreign aid to Israel unless the prime minister of Israel paid off our president? Would that be enough?
The gentlelady is very good. But I will also continue to say, if the gentlelady, my report is specific to this action, and the gentlelady is laying out a hypothetical and laying out a theoretical, which is fine, but with all due respect, I'm just not going to participate in it.
All right, then, would the gentleman agree that if the president abused his office if we could agree that the president had sought this favor for personal political reasons rather than one of these after-the-fact explanations that he's offered, would that be impeachable if we agreed upon the intent?
Look, and again, this is sort of a last round around this. If you had alleged crimes, if you had alleged actual things in abuse of power, instead of saying an amorphous abuse of power, which is what we list in our report, instead of going to that, none of those specific charges were listed in your abuse of power, but yet you propagated your report with all of these other things. There are ways that you can build it, and the gentlelady knows my answer is can there be an abuse of power? Yes. And I've never not denied that. But what I'm not going to do, not because I do not find it convincing or relative to this hearing of getting a rule to put this on the floor tomorrow, is what our report actually says. Is there abuse of power evident? Yes, you can go back to the Nixon impeachment. There were abuse of power. Those are things that you can look at. In this highlight here, and Mr. Raskin, I'm sure, can discuss this at length in his discussion, I will go back to what I find here is not an abuse of power. I've said this clearly on many occasions, and to engage in hypotheticals to make this abuse of power look better, I'm just not going to do. And I appreciate the gentlelady.
Mr. Raskin, you had something?
Yes. President Nixon was charged in the abuse of power article with conducting a break-in of his political opponent's campaign headquarters. President Trump is essentially being charged with conducting a break-in of American democracy in order to harm his political opponent. The two crimes are quite analogous. Now, one has the additional factor, as you just pointed out, Ms. Scanlon, of dragging a foreign government into the equation, which was something extra that the framers feared greatly. But both of these are abuses of power. The House of Representatives didn't say, you've got to demonstrate that he's been convicted of burglary in the District of Columbia or conspiracy to commit burglary before you take it up as abuse of power, right? And so it is true that our abuse of power claim has some overlapping elements with bribery, as we've discussed thoroughly in the report, with honest services fraud against the people, perhaps extortion, and perhaps many other crimes. And all of those things can be prosecuted under the Constitution later, but that doesn't absolve us of our constitutional responsibility to prevent high crimes and misdemeanors against the American people in the meantime.
I guess
would the gentleman
one
man-
last try, Mr. Collins. Let me just,
I have something I was going to say. So it's fine.
I'm just curious. I mean, we have the precedent of President Nixon, who was accused of abuse of power because he ordered the FBI to investigate his political opponents to get dirt on them. Do you think that was impeachable?
Again, I'll comment on the phone call of this year. And also I'll talk what Mr. Turley said. And when he said facts must be clear, convincing, and comprehensive. This record is contested. And so the majority has not accepted exculpatory evidence here. So I think when you look at it from our perspective, that's what we laid out in our report. And it goes back to the fact that I inherently will sit here with the facts in dispute, do not believe it's the abuse of power based on this phone call.
And Mr. Collins, I'm just trying to find out what, if anything, you would consider impeachable, because we haven't seen that yet. I mean, you won't even concede what was precedent from the Nixon situation, and here we have a situation. I'm asking, if the facts were to show that the president withheld foreign aid to another country in order to get a personal political favor, not for matters of national security, would that be impeachable? And you don't seem able to answer that question.
I seem very capable of answering. I'm just not going to follow your path on where you wanted me to lead, because at the same point in time, I've got to do. You and I both have to vote on words on paper, and words on paper tomorrow is this case. It's not the hypothetical event, because I don't believe you've made this case, and that's why I'm pushing back on it, and we'll continue very politely to push back on this. I'm just not going to go down this road because you've not made your case. Now, you can convince yourself and others that you can.
With all due respect, Mr.
But
Collins,
that's my minority
the
report,
House
and I'll
is
leave
not
it.
the finder of fact. The trial is for the Senate. Right here, we're talking about whether there's enough evidence to make out the case.
And I disagree.
I believe that there is.
And I disagree there's not.
Fine. I guess one other thing I wanted to just push back on is this idea that somehow this impeachment process is some kind of radical left plot of some sort. I do have to thank our colleagues on the other side for giving my children a good laugh, that they're, soccer mom, carpool driving, PTA, running the Apple Festival at the Methodist Church. Mom is some kind of radical. But I did want to make clear for the record that the only radical view I'm embracing here is the idea that we, the people, should be governed by a constitution that divides powers between three co-equal branches and establishes checks and balances on the president. And despite the rhetoric that somehow this is a completely partisan exercise, my faith in these core constitutional principles is I believe it's still a shared American value that unites Democrats, independents, conservatives, libertarians. I think there is a growing consensus, even among Republicans who speak off the record or are not dependent on the president for continuation in their job. And I'd just like to point to a couple of examples. This weekend, Tom Ridge, the former Republican governor of my home state, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the first Homeland Secretary of the United States, member of Congress, Vietnam vet, said that he believed the president's conduct here was an abuse of power to ask a foreign leader for a political favor. Our former colleague, Mr. Dent, also from Pennsylvania, said he's spoken with Republicans who are absolutely disgusted and exhausted by the president's behavior. Another former Republican colleague of ours, David Jolly, said we have witnessed an impeachable moment Former Republican Congressman Reed Ribble of Wisconsin said recently, clearly there was some type of quid pro quo, and when asked if he believes the testimony presented warrants impeachment, he said, "I do." Former South Carolina Republican Congressman Bob Inglis, who served on the Judiciary Committee during the Clinton impeachment, said last month, "Without a doubt, if Barack Obama had done the things revealed in the testimony in the current inquiry, we Republicans would have impeached him." And while I'm hesitant, I don't want my colleagues to have a stroke, Joe Scarborough, who is a former Republican congressman from Florida, said every Republican knows that Donald Trump was asking for dirt on Joe Biden in exchange for releasing the military funds. These are just a few of the folks who've come out here.
Ms.
And
Scanlon, would you yield just one moment so I can add one?
certainly,
William Webster, the only person that has been the FBI director and CIA director, said the same thing.
okay. And at age 95. Okay, and with that, I would yield back. Mr. Raskin, did you have anything further?
I just want to
Before I
say, nothing strikes me as more conservative than wanting to conserve the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the political order that has been bequeathed to us by the framers and the founders. And the conservative tradition is a great tradition in America, like the liberal tradition. In the heart of the word liberal is liberty. And liberals have every reason to stand up for the Constitution now. Just like progressives, people who look for progress, they have every reason to rally around the Constitution. We're not one political party. We're not one political belief system or ideology. We're not one race or ethnicity, but we've got one Constitution in our country. We've got to cling really closely to our Constitution through this period. And I know that doesn't mean we're all going to agree in the end, but I think that if we're all constitutional patriots, we're going to be able to see our way through a very dark moment in American history.
Yeah. Could I comment on that? Just is the last. If not, you need to go back. It's fine. I understand.
Fine.
Okay. All these that you just mentioned, the Republicans you just mentioned, Tom Ridge, a great guy. In fact, the last time I saw him was a few months ago when he awarded Hakeem and I the Civility Award from Allegheny College. He's a good guy. There's just one difference in all these. They don't wear pins currently in this Congress. They're not voting on these articles.
And I
would
believe
have
I
to assume-
mentioned that.
And I would have to assume in my position that if they did, then we could always disagree. But they're not. And I think my only thing is from a constitutional perspective, and I appreciate it. And again, I'll just say this. I'm looking at facts. You're looking at facts. We disagree. And I think at the end of the day, that's the way it's got to be. And I didn't mean to prolong that. And from that perspective, I think it's not I don't fight less for the Constitution than Mr. Raskin here. I'll never back up on that argument. He can fight and say he's fighting for it. I'm going to fight and say I'm fighting for it. And that's my case then to my voters and the American people. To frame this in, anything else is just simply say, look, here's the facts. Let's deal with the facts and let's vote on it tomorh, and we'll go from there. I yield back. Thank you.
If I could add one thing to, I think, a fine statement by Mr. Collins. But for those out there who don't know Capitol Hill lingo, wearing a pin means, oh, I thought I had, there's my pin. You got to wear a pin in order to get into the buildings because there's so many of us. There's 435, so they don't recognize. Now, some of us are famous here. Mr. Collins is famous, so they'll let him in. But the rest of us, we got to wear our pins in order to get in. But I do want to push back against the idea that this conversation is only for people wearing pins. And I think America's got to think about this in a really profound way. The framers of the Constitution were trying to decide whether impeachment should be located in the Supreme Court and treated as a matter of law and legal induction, or whether it should be with Congress and the people's representatives. And they thought it was so important and so fundamental that it had to be with the people. Now, they know we're politicians. They know we've got other stuff going on. We're fighting, in our caucus to lower prescription drug prices, and we're fighting for the Equality Act, and we want to pass the universal criminal mental background check. My colleagues have an agenda. We've got an agenda. We've got to deal with all that and also think about impeachment. And what else do representatives have to do? We've got to interact with our constituents. So when people say to me, oh, well, you don't want to talk to the public about it, you just want to go decide, I don't think that's right. I think this is a national dialogue that we're engaged in here. It's about the destiny, the future of our whole country, our whole form of government. So I'm glad that you raised this. I'm glad that I hear from conservatives all the time who are on our side. I'm sure that there's some liberals who are on the other side. I think that's the way that it should be. I think we got to not be bound just by what these labels, certainly these partisan labels, are all about. You know, our greatest political leaders have understood that we're in partisan competition in the election. Like Thomas Jefferson, he was a real brawler when it came to elections. He was savvy, he was smart. But when he got elected in 1800 and he gave that inaugural speech, he said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And George Washington reminded people always that the word party comes from the French word parti, a part. Our party is just part of the whole. When we get into office, we have to try to look out for the whole, not just for our part. Barack Obama said, this is not the red states of America or the blue states of America. This is the United States of America. So when we get elected, we have to try to think about the good of everyone. And I know that everybody in this room comes in that spirit and is trying to speak to the whole country and not just to a narrow base.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. I can never match you on the historical references, but I do want to close by noting Franklin's response to a constituent when he and his fellow framers came out of Independence Hall in Philadelphia and they were asked what kind of a government they'd produce. And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." So I think your emphasis on people needing to
Use it wisely. I promise.
You said that to a New Yorker.
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. I want to thank both Mr. Raskin and Mr. Collins for enduring a long day and for all the hard work that you've put in. Just some observations and then a few questions, if I might. When America's founders gathered for the Second Constitutional Convention more than 230 years ago, they laid down not just laws and procedures, but the core principles and values that would guide this young nation. At that time, George Washington asked whether we are to have a government of respectability under which life, liberty, and prosperity are secured to us, or whether we are to submit to one which may be the result of chance or the moment springing perhaps by some aspiring demagogue who will not consult the interest of his country so much as his own ambitious views. The founders did not take lightly the matter of impeachment. As has been described, the journals of James Madison, for instance, detail a solemn and thoughtful debate among the framers over the power to remove a president and the conditions that would warrant such a decision. It was to be reserved only for treason, bribery, and although those were narrow, they added high crimes and misdemeanors, meaning not just serious crimes against an individual, but it borrows from 14th century English law, those crimes instead committed against the state itself, or in this case, the very nation the president is sworn to protect. And our founders feared two things, and you touched upon this earlier, Mr. Raskin, but two things above all others: the overreach of executive branch powers by what they called the chief magistrate or the president, and the interference of foreign powers. At the time, Great Britain and France most came to mind, but the interference of foreign powers in our domestic affairs. And both they feared would undermine the foundations of our democracy. In fact, those fears had given rise to the very revolution which the American colonies sought independence from in the first place. And those fears have been realized, in my view, in the actions of the president, exactly why impeachment exists at all. And the last time this committee gathered on the subject of the inquiry, I spoke of my hopes that the public phase of this process would bring answers for the American people on those allegations. And since that time, more than a month ago, we've heard, and members of the Judiciary Committee, we thank you, and members of the Intelligence Committee, because we've heard publicly from many key witnesses that have illuminated the alarming pattern of behavior the president has engaged in. And these witnesses are not partisan actors, but career diplomats, experienced intelligence officers, and dedicated public servants. And I have to say, parenthetically, one of the proudest things for me was to observe those people testifying and giving as people dedicated to the country, patriots who spoke out not as partisans, but as people who love this country. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman described the unprecedented subversion of America's national interest in a strong Ukraine in favor of a wholly personal interest of President Trump. Dr. Hill testified to the back channels outside of our usual national security and diplomatic policy that sought to exchange a White House meeting for investigations pursued by the president. Ambassador Sondland, closely involved in the campaign to pressure Ukraine at the behest of the president, declared in no uncertain terms that this was a clear quid pro quo. These and other brave Americans gave testimony not as partisan Democrats, but experts in their field, underscoring that this process has not been one of politics, but one of duty. We have remained committed to a fair and open process with the only goals of discovering the truth and protecting the American public, which is why I'm so troubled that members of the Trump administration have repeatedly refused to testify in hearings and provide transparency to make their argument to the public. Despite this, we now have a clear picture of what occurred between the President of the United States and the government of Ukraine. Regrettably, sadly, I'm convinced President Trump has abused the powers of his public office, leveraged a foreign government for political benefit, and obstructed necessary congressional oversight of his conduct. In the end, it comes down, I think, as you just mentioned, Mr. Raskin, to one simple question posed by George Mason 2 centuries ago. Shall any man be above justice? The answer, of course, must unequivocally be no. This is a profound moment in our nation's history. It is not just a responsibility, but our somber obligation to protect the Republic and uphold the very tenets it was founded upon, and that's why we must uphold our constitutional duty to justice by taking up these articles of impeachment. And I hope those on both sides of the aisle can see that we are at a crossroads. And the future of our country hinges on decisions like the ones we make today. We cannot abdicate our responsibility to our constituents, to our country, by choosing to ignore the grave and, in my view, unlawful actions of the President and threaten to unravel centuries of progress. I'm blessed, as many of us are, with 3 beautiful grandchildren and a 4th on the way. And when I talk to them about right and wrong, I want to be able to look them in the eye and tell them I've always done my best to uphold what is good, what is just, and what is fair. And today that means casting a vote to hold accountable a president, the highest office in the land, but a president who has blatantly and egregiously abused his office, jeopardized our national security, and put his own political favor ahead of our national interests. And for the sake of our children, our grandchildren, all of us, I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I'd like to, if I may, just pose a few questions. And part of it involves, admittedly, around the unclassified transcripts of the phone call. The argument being made by the President and his administration arguing that the call of July 25th was intended to deal with widespread corruption in Ukraine. That's as I understand the argument. Is that correct, Mr. Raskin? Do you see it the same way, Mr. Raskin?
Forgive me, whose argument?
The argument by the President and the White House is that their arguments and pushback was to combat general corruption, although it's not in any way described in the actual transcript. But that's the argument now being articulated.
It is impossible for me to take it seriously, given that I have researched all of the circumstances and the context, but I think that there's at least some half-hearted effort to stick with that story.
So, what's interesting when you read the transcript, Mr. Lutsenko was the prosecutor who I believe Trump was referring to in the phone call when he said, I heard to President Zelensky, he said, I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. A lot of people are talking about that, the way they shut him down, a very good prosecutor down, and you had some very bad people involved. That is Mr. Lutsenko that he's referring to, isn't it?
I guess it is.
No, it is not.
And-
No, it is not. It's Shokin.
Well, that's not,
Mr. Shokin.
Oh, it's not entirely clear then. Yeah.
it's not clear then, because that's not it's not mentioned at all. But the, Mr. Lutsenko is generally viewed to be corrupt himself. I mean, that was part of what had happened with President Zelensky, was the removal of Lutsenko and other prosecutors deemed to be corrupt by the world community. Is that not correct?
That is correct. But there was a history of corruption going back, and Zelensky was elected as a reformer. So yes.
And in fact, during the call, it does seem to me that, I don't want to say that the two presidents were talking past one another, but on the one hand, President Trump seemed to be arguing for retaining the prosecutors who had been deemed by the world community generally to be corrupt and to be pro-Russian, and yet President Zelensky is talking about bringing in new and capable people. Is that not how I read the transcript, or should I not read it that way?
I'm sorry, that who's talking, that Zelensky?
It's sort of like
Yes.
talking past each other. The president,
Yes.
President Trump is essentially arguing for the status quo, the prosecutors who have been deemed to be, is that,
Well, the way, the way I read it is that President Zelensky is walking a tightrope. He's
Correct.
elected as a reformer. He has taken on the corrupt forces in his society, but he is being presented essentially with yet another corrupt scheme. I mean, that's what's so heartbreaking about this, as described to us by Dr. Fiona Hill and Ambassador Yovanovitch. This was a moment where Ukraine was trying to move forward from all of the corruption. And as I think it was George Kent who said, we try to teach the other countries of the world not to engage in politically based prosecutions, not to have a situation where someone gets into office and then decides to prosecute their opponents or go after someone who is considered a political threat to the president. And here we were, the most powerful country in the world, which Ukraine was depending on, and we were essentially imposing that scenario on them.
yeah. And I do note that despite suggestions to the contrary, the only real references to this are the Biden, and as it says, at one point the president says, I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation. They say CrowdStrike, I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server, they say Ukraine has it, a lot of things that went on. Unfortunately, it's somewhat unintelligible to understand exactly what he's talking about, but at no point is there a suggestion that he's talking broadly about corruption. I want to just focus, if I can, in just a few minutes on the role of Rudy Giuliani in all of this. Obviously, well known to New Yorkers, but and I note that Ambassador Taylor, I think, in his testimony, said that he had suspicions before even taking the job, and said, in part, can anyone hope to succeed with the Giuliani-Biden issue swirling? What was your sense of what he meant by that in his testimony? Sure. Ambassador Taylor said that he had suspicions before taking his job, and he said, can anyone hope to succeed with the Giuliani-Biden issue swirling? Did he expand further upon that, and can you share that with us?
Well, the general concern was that no one knew quite in what capacity Rudy Giuliani was operating. I think that that is a dilemma and a confusion that persists to this very day. Sometimes he's acting as a businessman for himself. Sometimes he's acting as the president's personal lawyer. Sometimes he's acting as lawyers for other people. Sometimes he's acting on errands from foreign governments, or he's doing work with foreign governments. There's an interesting analyst of corruption today named Sarah Chase, who's written a lot about corruption in Afghanistan, where she lived, and she said, you've got to understand corruption today crosses different domains. So some of it's in the government sector, some of it's in the private corporate sector, some of it is in the underworld, and then you get certain players who cross all of these boundaries and unify them in different ways. So I think that people understood that Rudy Giuliani had the ear of the president. He seemed to be authorized or empowered by the president to go on this domestic political errand and try to make this happen. And he clearly had entree into the highest levels of the U.S. government and seemed to be working with a lot of the government officials who were involved there. That's why President Trump kept telling people, go talk to Rudy, talk to Rudy.
So did you hear in committee any evidence or uncover any evidence in the hearings that the White House lacked confidence in the State Department, the diplomatic corps, or the Department of Justice to communicate with Ukraine the need for a broad attack against corruption generally?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your question. Did we?
Did you uncover any evidence or hear any testimony that suggests the White House lacked confidence in the State Department or the Department of Justice or the diplomatic corps to communicate effectively with Ukraine the president's desire to worry about corruption generally?
Well, there's an unstated premise there, which is that the president had a general interest in fighting corruption in Ukraine. And we saw little or no evidence of that at all. Right. Remember, there had been hundreds of millions of dollars that had flowed to Ukraine under the prior corrupt president without a peep being mentioned about it. And it was during Zelensky's rise where the president got interested, but that didn't even have anything to do with Zelensky. It was because Joe Biden was running for president, and he was looking for a hook to go after Joe Biden. And this was the plan that he decided on, and he was monomaniacal and single-minded about the whole thing, and he brought a lot of people together to try to make that happen.
Right, so if you take the president at his word, which, I'm trying to give him every opportunity to make a case, you'd have to come to the conclusion that somehow he lacked confidence in the Department of Justice or the State Department or normal diplomatic channels. Otherwise, why would he turn to Rudy Giuliani, of all people, to conduct this investigation?
It's a great point. Attorney General Barr himself released a statement saying that President Trump had never contacted him with any evidence about the Bidens that he wanted to be investigated, and never asked him to use the formal diplomatic channels to connect with the law enforcement authorities in Ukraine. There are real crimes that are being committed by Americans around the world, or Americans are involved in conspiracies with different people. We actually have a way of working on this problem between governments. The president, who would have better access to the Department of Justice than anybody else in the country, never contacted the Department of Justice about getting in touch with Ukraine about any corruption that he knew about. He didn't turn over any evidence. He didn't suggest any clues. None of it. He just went directly to the president of Ukraine and told him what he wanted him to do. He wanted him to make that announcement about Joe Biden.
Well, and I do note, going back to the transcript, which is much talked about, where the president talks about, which I referenced just a few moments ago, the things that he was interested, which were narrowly about Biden's and the so-called server. It's actually Zelensky who raises the name Giuliani first. So it's clearly something that had been communicated and well before July 25th, because he says, I will personally tell you that one of my assistants spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently, and we are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine, and we will meet once when he comes to Ukraine. And clearly, there's already a pathway, and clearly Giuliani, who I don't think would be tapped to talk about corruption generally, when you had Attorney General Barr and you have Secretary Pompeo and thousands of members of both the State Department and the Department of Justice that could do it, why they would choose Giuliani. But that's clearly a cue for President Zelensky in this conversation to raise the name of Giuliani. It's then the president suggests that a lot of people are talking about that, the way they shut your very good prosecutor down and you had some very bad people involved. Mr. Giuliani is a highly respected man. He was the mayor of New York. I would like him to call you. I will ask him to call you along with the Attorney General. Rudy very much knows what's happening. He's a very capable guy. If you would speak to him, that would be great. An indication that, again, these unusual channels of operating, not through normal diplomatic channels, and then again, later on in the conversation, the president, well, she's going to go through some things. Speaking of Ambassador Yovanovitch, I will have Mr. Giuliani give you a call, and I'm also going to have Attorney General Barr call, and we'll get to the bottom of it. And again, the president, good. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I will tell Rudy and Attorney General Barr to call you. And so on it goes. And it is just, in my mind, troubling that Mr. Giuliani would be mentioned in the same breath repeatedly with the Attorney General, and clearly representing the president personally. And as you point out, it's hard to tell what role he's playing at any given moment. Is he the president's personal attorney? Is he a representative of the United States? Is he doing the president's political bidding for him? Or is he doing something that relates to his own commercial and business interests? Yesterday, Mr. Giuliani is reported to have said that President Trump was given detailed information about how Ambassador Yovanovitch was impeding investigations that could benefit Mr. Trump. Not that benefit the United States, but benefit Mr. Trump. Giuliani told the president, Secretary Pompeo, that Ms. Yovanovitch was blocking visas for Ukrainian prosecutors to come to the United States to present evidence to him, Giuliani, and federal authorities that he claimed to be damaging to Vice President Biden and to Ukrainians who distributed documents that led to the resignation of President Trump's 2016 campaign chair, Paul Manafort. Is there any evidence at all that supports any of Mr. Giuliani's claims against Ambassador Yovanovitch, either those that were reported yesterday or reported earlier in this investigation?
Well, it's a great question, because we asked that to numerous of the witnesses, whether there was anything to this conspiracy theory, basically. And the answer we got was, no, there's basically nothing to it. They are not aware that there was an organized campaign by the Ukrainian government to get involved in our 2016 campaign. My friend, Mr. Collins, rightfully pointed out that he and other supporters of the president in this matter have said there were Ukrainians who said things, and I think the Ukrainian ambassador of the United States was one of the ones who said things, but you cannot put that in the same sentence or paragraph or book with what Russia has been doing to elections around the world. Our Department of Justice Special Counsel found a sweeping and systematic campaign to subvert and undermine the American election. They had hundreds of employees working on this around the clock. They spent millions of dollars or rubles doing it. They were trying to inject poison racial and ethnic and religious propaganda into our social media system. And that's, one thing, Mr. Morelli, that makes me very sad, that our country is divided. I don't think it's divided because we're trying to stand up for the rule of law and impeachment investigation, but the Russian attack on American democracy did have a lot to do with it. I mean, why did we have hundreds of neo-Nazis and Klansmen marching in broad daylight in Charlottesville? It's because there was divisive racial propaganda, ethnic and religious propaganda pumped into American society. So I think that it's almost a patriotic duty for us in this very tough time to see that we try to bridge partisan and ethnic and racial and sectional differences, regional, all of those things. We cannot allow the enemies of democracy to exacerbate pre-existing fault lines in the country and open up old gulfs within our country.
Yeah, and just extending that further, I note in the deposition from Dr. Hill, she is quoted as saying, "I went back to talk to Ambassador Bolton, and Ambassador Bolton asked me to go over and report this to our NSC counsel, to John Eisenberg. He told me, direct quote, 'You go and tell Eisenberg that I'm not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this, and you go and tell him that you've heard and what I've said.' So I went over to talk to John Eisenberg about this. I told him exactly, what had transpired, and that Ambassador Sondland had basically indicated that there was an agreement with the chief of staff that they would have a White House meeting or, a presidential meeting if the Ukrainians start up these investigations again. And the main thing that I was personally concerned about, as I said to John, was that he did this in front of the Ukrainians. But I want to go back to and extend this to the result of Mr. Giuliani's campaign that he had set in motion against Ambassador Yovanovitch was also, this is part of the deposition from Dr. Hill. Why did the removal of Ambassador Yovanovitch mark a turning point for you? And this is to your point about throwing out conspiracies, et cetera. Because there's no basis for her removal. The accusations against her had no merit whatsoever. This was a mismatch of conspiracy theories that, again, I've told you I believe firmly to be baseless. An idea of an association between her and George Soros. I had accusations similar to this being made against me as well. My entire first year of my tenure at National Security Council filled with hateful calls, conspiracy theories, which has started again, frankly, as it's been announced that I've been giving this deposition. She goes on to say, the most obvious explanation of the point seemed to be business dealings of individuals who wanted to improve the investment positions inside of Ukraine itself, and also to deflect aware on the findings of not just the Mueller report on Russian interference, but what's also been confirmed by your own Senate report, and what I know myself to be true as a former intelligence analyst and someone who's been working on Russia for more than 30 years. So the fact that Ambassador Yovanovitch was removed as a result of this, I have to say, was pretty dispiriting. Who did you understand was responsible for her removal? I understood this as a result of the campaign that Mr. Giuliani had set in motion in conjunction with people who were writing articles and, publications that I could have expected better of. She's then asked, and you discuss Ambassador Yovanovitch with Ambassador Bolton? I did. What was his reaction to this? His reaction was pained, and he basically said, in fact, he directly said, Rudy Giuliani is a hand grenade that is going to blow everybody up. He made it clear that he didn't feel that there was anything that he could personally do about this. Ambassador Bolton. I also note in a meeting on July 2nd in Toronto, Canada, Ambassador Volker conveyed to President Zelensky the quid pro quo described Ambassador Sondland. In doing so, he referenced the Giuliani factor and the need for the announcement of the two political investigations. And I note parenthetically, Ambassador Sondland would later testify, Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States of America. We knew these investigations were important to the President, and it wasn't so much that the investigations be done, merely that there be an announcement of the investigation so that it would aid the President's election campaign.
And Mr. Morelli, if
Yes.
I might, that's an excellent point. That might be the ultimate and most devastating refutation of the idea that the president was interested in ferreting out corruption. He didn't really care about the investigation. He just wanted the announcement for electoral purposes.
And that's the testimony of his, his ambassador, Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Volker had breakfast with Mr. Giuliani and his associate Lev Parnas at the Trump Hotel in here in Washington. The same Mr. Parnas, I note, who is currently under indictment for campaign finance violations. During the conversation, according to Volker's testimony, the ambassador stressed his belief that attacks being leveled against the former vice president related to Ukraine were false and that Biden was a man of integrity. He counseled Mr. Giuliani that the Ukrainian prosecutor Lutsenko was promoting a self-serving narrative to preserve himself in power. According to Ambassador Volker, Mr. Giuliani agreed, but the promotion of Lutsenko's false accusations for the benefit of President Trump did not cease. Was any testimony presented that in any way contradicts that testimony by Ambassador Volker?
I don't believe so.
Also, testimony on August 2nd, Zelensky's advisor, Mr. Yermak, met with Mr. Giuliani in Madrid. They agreed Ukraine would issue a public statement. Again, I note that, it's the public statement part of this because that undermines the Biden candidacy. It does nothing to address corruption because the president, as it was testified by Ambassador Sondland, Mr. Trump didn't seem to care at all about whether the investigation was actually conducted, simply that it was announced. And Volker encouraged Giuliani to report to the boss of his results of his meeting with Mr. Yermak so that the White House visit could be arranged, which was was sought after, as we know, by Ukraine. I'll stop there and relate to questions about Mr. Giuliani, which to me need was to reach out to Mr. Giuliani, although there's no evidence of his failure of confidence in them. We must assume Mr. Giuliani was in a special position to pursue Ukrainian corruption generally, although there's no evidence or rationale for that at all. We must assume Ambassador Sondland and Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney were both in error when they confirmed a quid pro quo. We must assume Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, Ambassadors Taylor, Volker, Sondland, and Yovanovitch, as well as Mr. Holmes and Dr. Hill, were all arrayed against the president, despite not a modicum of evidence to that regard. We must assume that the White House officials like Donald McGahn and John Bolton and others somehow hold the key to the president's innocence if only they would testify. But of course, they refuse to testify. The list goes on, and I choose to follow the evidence which is laid out in the reports of the House Intelligence Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, and I continue to urge support of the rule and the underlying articles of impeachment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raskin, at the heart of, I want to follow up on the accusations against Vice President Biden, which is at the heart of what we're talking about. President Trump's smears against the vice president are debunked accusations made by a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor, Viktor Shulkin. You heard me right. President Trump and his supporters are so desperate to undermine Vice President Biden that they actually colluded with a Ukrainian fraudster. Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent testified that there was, quote, broad-based consensus, end quote, among the United States, our European allies, and international financial institutions that Mr. Shokin was, and I quote, a typical Ukrainian prosecutor who lived a lifestyle far in excess of his government salary, who never prosecuted anyone known for having committed a crime, and who covered up crimes that were known to have been committed. That's a nice way to say that everyone in the entire world agreed that this Ukrainian prosecutor was a bad guy and corrupt. And so, Mr. Raskin, would it be accurate to say that the allegations that Vice President Biden inappropriately pressured Ukraine to remove Mr. Shokin are completely without merit?
Totally without merit. Vice President Biden was acting to articulate and implement U.S. foreign policy at that moment, and that policy was to get rid of a corrupt prosecutor.
Okay, so let me repeat. It was part of the official policy of the United States and the rest of the world to fight corruption in Ukraine, correct?
Yes, it was.
Did Vice President Biden ask Ukraine to help him cheat in an election like President Trump?
No, he did not.
Okay, you know, we can obfuscate all we want, but it won't change the simple fact there is nothing appropriate about President Trump's personal lawyer continuing to run around Kiev with corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutors in search of dirt about Joe Biden. I believe the American people know that Joe Biden is an honorable man, and they know it's wrong to seek foreign help to cheat in an election. And the president's ongoing pressure on Ukraine to investigate the former vice president is powerful evidence for why we have no choice but to move forward with these articles of impeachment. Mr. Chairman, there is nothing more distressing to me than the fact that not one of our Republican colleagues are willing to confront the president over his misconduct. And I have credibility on this. I confronted President Clinton on his misconduct. I've come to impeachment with deep sadness. The facts of this case are painful and indisputable. We know that the president abused his office, asking the leader of the Ukraine to announce an investigation of his political rival. We know that he illegally held up congressional appropriated aid to the Ukraine. And we know that he conditioned the release of vital military aid on Ukrainian President Zelensky's opening an investigation based on a debunked conspiracy theory about his political rival and foreign interference in the 2016 election. We also know that the president has actively blocked congressional attempts to determine the extent of his misconduct by ordering executive branch officials to defy subpoenas and withhold information. These facts are uncontested, confirmed in public by career public servants who have dedicated their lives to serving our country. Further, they are uncontested by the president and confirmed by his chief of staff. We have now reached a point where, despite the unprecedented obstruction from the president, the evidence in this case is powerful enough to delay this vote any further would be irresponsible. Any delay would risk interference in the 2020 election and the permanent erosion of our system of checks and balances. This is not a matter of politics. I have never and will never support the impeachment of a president over a policy disagreement or a different ideology. This is a matter of protecting the integrity of our democracy for the next generation. As we labor to pass on to future generations many of the great hallmarks of our society, our financial might, our brilliant scientific enterprises, the gifts of our great natural resources, the strength of our military and the diplomatic corps as a force for good, we must also work with active stewardship and vigilance to pass on a vibrant and functional democracy. If we don't do our duty to protect the Constitution, the republic that we hand to our children will be less vibrant, less resilient, Constitution knew that democracy is fragile. They knew that its survival depends on the strength and the courage we display in maintaining it. But this fragility is also a strength. It requires our public servants to put our nation's interests ahead of our own, to root out corruption and to hold each other accountable for the high standards of democracy that democracy demands. That's why we take an oath to defend the Constitution. If protecting the Constitution were trivial, we wouldn't have to take an oath. For over 200 years, honesty and vigilance and courage have won out as generations of Americans have adhered to their oath of office and met the standards of service that our democracy necessitates. Many died protecting our democracy. We cannot let this legacy be damaged on our watch. President Trump has not treated his oath of office with the seriousness it requires. But ultimately, this is not only a vote about one person. This is a vote about his and our oath of office. This is a vote to determine whether we will maintain our democracy or set our nation on a path to upend the values and standards the framers laid out for us. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's the most aspiring thing I've heard, hopeful thing today, which may be a reflection of what we're doing here. I do want to say, on coming in here 7, 8 hours ago, and I've heard a few of my colleagues on both sides say this, it's hard not to be, as a member of this institution who has great reverence for this institution. I've heard Mr. Collins say many times that he believes in, he's an institutionalist. Not to be sad. I think we are all sad and depressed from our perspectives, because this is not the institution as it's at its optimum. And I'll say for the accusations about never Trumpers, I guess I will admit to being an almost never Trumper. After he was elected, I agreed with President Obama and Secretary Clinton that we should give him a chance. And I remember teasing some of my staff, well, maybe he's Chester Arthur, where people thought when Arthur took over for Garfield, given his reputation in New York, no offense, that he would not be capable. And he turned out to start the civil service system, which we have benefited from in the last few months when we've seen these really courageous public servants come forward, irrespective of your position. You can't help but admire these folks. And then having sat as a member of the oversight and sat in hours of those depositions with Mr. Raskin and others, Ambassador Taylor, Colonel Velleman, it's just remarkable in getting the sense of that. And then having read the 300 pages and listened to the intelligence hearings and the judiciary hearings, my concern is that I've heard members of both parties say, there's a pattern here. And I'll be honest, I'm concerned about the pattern, but the president's pattern. One of the reasons why I was an early signer on to Steve Cohen's articles of impeachment.
Mr. Chairman, the committee's not moving.
I'm not offended. Okay. But having signed on to Cohen's that never came to the floor, as the chairman said, I approached supporting those as referring it to the Judiciary Committee to have a hearing, because my own intuitive belief is this particular president, whether Republican or Democrat, in my perception, rules don't have the same effect on him as the majority of people, and I think rules are important. And I think, unfortunately, it's part of our business culture right now that stretching the rules or breaking the rules and getting away from them is part of what's wrong with this country. So Mr. Raskin and Mr. Collins, I have really one question. In this pattern of things, we're all going to live with the consequences of our votes. I hear my colleagues feel strongly that they will vote against these. Most likely, apparently, Mr. McConnell believes there'll be a trial that the president will be acquitted. So what I'm afraid of is that the president will be empowered to break more rules. I don't think he's capable of, and I hope that's not true. So what happens after this? And I want to read a quote from James Madison in 51, when he talked about the balance of and I'm an amateur, I hate to say this in front of a professional like Mr. Raskin, but I want him to reply to this, because I don't take this as a hypothetical. Our actions and the actions of the Senate are part of a pattern, and either it will be corrected after this is all done, or if I'm right, the president will go ahead and push the rules again, and I'm mindful that he made this phone call the day after the Mueller report. And this is in the context of foreign interference, that the British, the French, the Germans twice during World War I and World War II were very aggressive at affecting our democracy. The founders were perceptive and understanding in a democracy in those days, which was an unusual thing, that Madison said you had to bind the institutions, these three institutions, the judiciary, the presidency, and the Congress, bind them so there's a check and balance, which is what 51 is all about. But put this in the context of what we know from the Mueller report and what Mr. Raskin's talked about, and the technology that Mr. Putin and his agents have perfected. We as Americans tend to think in American exceptionalism, maybe sometimes that the Russians aren't very sophisticated. They are very, very sophisticated at propaganda that, as Mr. Raskin said, its ultimate goal is to disrupt democracy and have us basically destroy ourselves. Because Mr. Putin believes the worst thing that happened to Russia was the implosion of the Soviet Union and glasnost. And he sees the mass of men and women as incapable of governing themselves, which to us sitting here, I think we all believe, whether we're conservative or liberal, that is the opposite of what we live for, what people have sacrificed their lives for. So Mr. Putin wants us to be fighting each other. They've used social media, and somebody from the Bay Area who deals with these companies and is frustrated with them to govern themselves, they have used it in a way, as the Mueller report says, to support this president, according to the report. And I thought that was damning enough to go ahead with impeachment, but we didn't. And the obstruction was clear to me, but we didn't. So in the context of that report, and sitting here a few months before our Democratic primary, which will be super primary in March, and less than a year away from an election, knowing that they're going to do these things, in the context of what we are going to do, is not a hypothetical. It's part of a continuing effort by foreign actors who do not believe in this institution or in democracy or average people governing themselves. What do we anticipate the consequences after we vote tomorrow and after the Senate takes what I think is a mistake in their action? So let me just read what Madison said. And all the founders were amazing writers because people wrote and read well then. So he said in 51, he said, "The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern, neither external or internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So our failure to control ourselves as a Congress for the difficulties of the time make me think that the consequences of our decisions and the inability to hold this president accountable and constrain him properly under the Constitution is not a hypothetical. It's something we're going to have to deal with in the days to come and before the next election, while foreign actors and domestic actors try to disrupt our democracy. So, Mr. Raskin, Professor Raskin, what do we do after this decision? How do we constrain the administration and properly balance that with the needs of this institution?
You ask that at 6:50 p.m. That's a big question, Mr. Desaulniers, but I'll try my hardest. Let's see.
30 seconds left.
Mr. Collins, if you want to jump in, I don't think it's a hypothetical. I'd love to hear your opinion.
I'm going to give it my best shot. First, what are the consequences in terms of the 2020 election? That's something, now, let me say this. I don't want to assume the inevitability of your premise that we're not actually going to deal with this problem. The House of Representatives has been immersed in this. We know a lot more about the facts. We know a lot more about the details, and now it's going over to the Senate. And I want to believe that 100 senators are going to adhere to their constitutional oath, reflect on what that means, and then be open-minded, critical thinking jurors in the process, okay. But what would happen if we don't deal with it, if we all just go home and say, hey, you know, authoritarianism is on the march all over the world, democracy's on the run, there's only so much we can do at this point, and we don't deal with it? Well, I think President Zelensky's got to be watching, Ukraine's got to be watching. From their perspective, they're in the middle of this. I mean, all of us are sort of acting like, well, President Trump got caught, so of course they're not going to go through with it. But if we let him go, why won't they go through with it? Why won't he have to go through with it? Why won't he have to make his announcement about the Bidens, and then for his own domestic political consumption, he'll have to go through with an investigation? We've just set a new precedent there, a new standard that the president can go and try to recruit foreign governments to get in our campaign by threatening, announcing, and engaging in criminal investigations of their political opponents. That's banana republic stuff, right? That's tin pot dictator stuff, but we've set that as a standard. So that terrifies me. Here's another pattern that we've got to deal with. Robert Mueller came to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on July the 24th. And as the president mentioned on the phone call on July 25th, he thought basically he'd gotten away with everything, right? Mueller found a sweeping and systematic campaign by Russia. He found more than 100 contacts with the Trump campaign. But Attorney General Barr had taken the report for 3.5 weeks, and he had said to America, there's nothing in there, nothing to be seen here, prompting not one but 2 letters of protest from Special Counsel Mueller. And yet it was too late for democracy to catch up, to have a serious, rigorous analysis of what was in the report. And on the very next day, President Trump has the phone call with President Zelensky and says, but do us a favor, though, kind of putting the icing on the cake of this whole effort to drag them in to our domestic politics. That's a pattern, because if it can be done to one struggling democracy, it can be done to another struggling democracy. And if we can allow one tyrannical, authoritarian despot like Vladimir Putin to come on in, the water's warm, well, why not others? Why not Turkey? Why not the president's friends in Saudi Arabia? He already basically whitewashed their assassination, murder, and dismemberment of a Washington Post journalist. So what big deal would it be for them to say, come on in and get involved in our election campaign? So that's a serious problem. Now, what about, you say, the pattern about checks and balances? It's interesting because the phrase checks and balances appears in the Federalist Papers not to refer to the 3 branches. It's not legislative, executive, judicial. It refers to the House and the Senate. And those are the checks and balances we should be thinking about right now, because the people's body will speak this week. And if it goes the way I hope we will go, we will impeach this president for abuse of power. We will impeach this president for obstruction of the Congress. But we are placing our faith, as the Constitution obligates us to, in the Senate to do their job. But what that also means is place our faith in the people to make the Senate do their job, because we're politicians and we know that we don't respond exclusively and entirely to the will of the constituents, but we do a lot. That's an important ingredient in representative democracy. But look, in Congress itself, we cannot be afraid of our own power. One thing I disagreed with, I think I heard one of my majority colleagues today say, is we've got 3 co-equal branches. And I've been trying to correct this from the very beginning. Our framers, the founders of America, overthrew a king. And in the first sentence of the Constitution, in the preamble, they stated what America was about. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, do hereby ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. The very next sentence starts Article 1. All legislative power is vested in the Congress of the United States, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. You see what just happened there? The sovereign political power of the people of America flowed from the act of constitution making into the Congress of the United States. And then you get 37 paragraphs laying out all the powers of Congress, the power of appropriation and spending, the power to regulate commerce domestically and internationally, the power to declare war, the power over the seat of government, the power over copyright, and so on and on. Even the power in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, to have all the other powers necessary to the enforcement and execution of the foregoing powers. And then in Article 2, you get to the president. And remember, in the Articles of Confederation, in the Articles of Association, we didn't even have a president, right? So they wanted to create somebody who would show executive energy to execute our laws, but that was the job, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed and to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy in times of actual insurrection, right? That's the core of what the job is. And Section 4 of Article 2 is all about impeachment in order to make sure a president doesn't become a king. Think about this. Why do we have the power to impeach the president and he doesn't have the power to impeach us? And it was a great Republican president, Gerald Ford, who answered it. Here the people rule. Here the people and their representatives rule. So if the president were to be impeached, he doesn't go to jail for 1 day because of that. That's criminal prosecution. It's got nothing to do with us. But what we're doing is protecting the country and the Constitution.
Mr. Collins, you want 30 seconds?
I think my friend just summed up the entire thing for me. He did. We went on a whirlwind trip. He is a wonderful teacher. I would have loved to have had him in class. And he went all over the world at a 30,000-foot level. You'd watch him along, and his oratorical skim down to touch the common man and come up and touch the wings of the gods. The problem is he never addressed the issue we're dealing with. And I think that's the very heart of the problem we have right now. It is one thing to speak in brash or rhetorical flourishes today, and we have, and we're getting to an end, thank you, Lord, of dealing with this. But the bottom line is the question I believe he asked, where do we go from here? Mm-hmm. It's like the simple man who once needed to get his, it was, I used to watch it, and I know this may come strange to my colleagues on the majority side. I really enjoy The West Wing. I watch it, my family has watched it over and over and over again. And that answer right there, which I respect deeply, it is amazing. We differ on so many things, but actually, Jamie and I just get along very well on many other things. He's wrong, I'm right, but we'll deal with that. No, I'm kidding. But there was an episode in which President Bartlett was in one of his rhetorical flourishes. And Toby asked him about a friend who had called about getting something fixed at the VA. And he went into this long story. If you remember this scene, he went into this long story about the red tape and that veterans had to come to D.C. and because they were tabled with red tape. That's where red tape come from. And Charlie, who was the body man for the president, looked at him. He said, but Mr. President, all he wanted to know was how to get his wheelchair fixed. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of here today. It's future. What is going on? What's going to happen? What happens tomorrow? What's going to happen tomorrow is you're going to vote the articles of impeachment. Probably after that, it's going to go to the Senate, which has been a predetermined observation from day one, not because of anything else. It's not going anywhere, and that's fine. That's the path we chose. But where do we go from here? This is my question. Because I think when you look at this, to simply say, and to come at it from the facts, which is the only way the majority can come at this, is that the president did something wrong. At which point has he ever done anything right for this majority? He never has. And I think when you look at the discussion, and I understand your discussion, Mr. Perlmutter, I get it. But when you look at it from the fact that from the moment after the election, there was discussion of impeachment. From minutes after he was sworn in, the Washington Post said, now the impeachment begins. When we begin to look at this process all the way through, my only question is not when do we do this, how or where do we go from here? It's just when. It's just when do we do it again? Because it's not a matter of this facts. And it was like I said earlier, not engaging in hypotheticals. We go back to the simple basic facts of happened in this case. 4 basic truths. Zelensky and President Trump said no pressure. The transcript shows no conditionality. The Ukrainians were not aware of the aid was being held when they spoke. And the Ukrainians didn't open an investigation, still received aid, and got a meeting with the president. There were 5 meetings, 3 of which took place from the call till the time the Ukrainians found out about the aid being held. 2 of those meetings were held after they found out about the aid being held. None of these, ranging from President Trump to Senators Johnson and Murphy, Vice President Pence, none of these actually discussed aid being linked to the money. None. So we start off and we get rhetorical flourishes here at the end, which is fine. I understand it. If I had to sell this, I would have to be rhetorically and flourish as well, because the Constitution is at stake here. It is the determination, is this Congress going to become a body in which we impeach because of partisan ideas, which is also what the founders discussed. You have the majority. We had the majority for a while I was here, for 6 years. It's a massive responsibility. And at times we did it well, and at times we did not do it well. And I believe that is why probably last November we got an election that gave you the majority and gave you the gavel. But remember, just because you can, don't mean you should. And sometimes when the facts, especially when you have to go at them from a perspective of the way this process has went, as I said earlier today, I'll fight process and I'll fight facts, and I'll win on both. Because when I take this case from here at this table in just a few minutes when we leave, then I'll take it to the floor tomorrow, and then I'll take it to the American people, just as this president will, and just as those who fought. And when we understand what actually happened, when what is actually charged, not what was assumed and not what was put deep into a report, but what was actually ended up, then I simply see nothing that helps us down the line. But I do see 2 things that bother me, and this will finish my statement to you. I see a process that has been trashed in the rules and processes of the committee and of the whole. And I see a process of impeachment that has been lowered to where you don't even have to jump anymore. And that is my concern. I know Mr. Raskin doesn't share it, but that you ask, that is my concern. Where do we go from here? In some ways, looking at this, God help us. I yield back.
Let the record know that was more than 30 seconds. Let me just finish with, from my perspective, the specificity. And Mr. Cole and I were talking about people reading the summary of the phone call and different people reading it and having different realities when they read it. But as all of us can relate to, a candidate for federal office, the law says, cannot, quote, knowingly solicit, accept, or receive from a foreign national any contribution or donation. And that contribution or donation is defined as anything of value. When I read that summary, he's clearly asking for something of value, an investigation that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars against his primary opponent. The day after the Mueller report, a day before, he went out, I'm told, and said that the Second Amendment gave him the right to do anything he wanted. So with that, just maybe briefly, Mr. Raskin, the president withheld his funds. Mr. Collins says he released them, but my recollection is in the testimony, he released them because people in the Congress and the press were starting to say, you need to release these. So it was the pressure brought to him to release it that got him to release it. And in that time, the Ukraine was exposed to his patron, Mr. Putin. So was he faithfully executing the duties of his office when he did that?
Well, he got caught red-handed, and I don't see any ambiguity in the historical record about that. We announced our investigation on the 9th of September, and then it was on the 11th that the money was finally released.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I have good news for both of you. I think everybody has asked their questions. There's nobody left here on this committee. I do want to close with this. First, I want to thank both our witnesses for enduring this very long hearing. I want to thank the members of the Rules Committee, Democrats and Republicans, because I think we have very sharp disagreements on this. But I think this hearing was conducted with civility. I want to thank Mr. Cole and his team for helping with that. I mean, I like this hearing, quite frankly, better than the one that was in your committee. But I mean, I think people feel very strongly about these issues, and I think, yeah, you know, and I want to thank everybody for their cooperation here today. And so you guys are dismissed, and there are no other witnesses here, so that will end the hearing portion of this.
Mr. Chairman?
7:55, yes, Mr.
Could I be recognized for
You
unanimous
may.
consent
Yeah,
request?
sure. All right, then, we haven't,
I
ignore what I
have-
just said, yeah.
I have the 4 letters that I sent individually asking to review the documents, 2 letters that were group projects, and I would like to add those.
Without
to the record.
objection.
And then also, I think it's significant that President Poroshenko came and talked to a joint session of Congress, many remember, in 2014.
The gentleman deserves to be heard.
In his address, he referenced a lot of things, how Ukraine had voluntarily withdrawn from being a nuclear power with the promise that they would always be protected, and then maybe they weren't. But he also, this was a speech in which he also said that they needed more military equipment, both lethal and non-lethal. Blankets and night vision goggles are important, but you cannot win a war with blankets. And again, this was from 2014. Donald Trump was not president, but I just thought it was important to put in as part of the record, as we've heard,
Without
about
objection.
how national security was threatened by President Trump's actions.
So the hearing portion of HRS 755 has come to a close, and we will recess subject to the call of the chair, and we will work with you about an appropriate time to reconvene to meet some of the obligations that your members have and our members have. Okay? Yeah, tonight, we meet tonight, yeah. With that, the hearing is closed. I can promise you that. Yeah, I can promise you that. I think it'll be at a decent hour.
When we hear